Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of western North Dakota, in a place that doesn't appear on any modern map but locals call the Hollow. The plan was simple enough. Brian Wright, my best friend since college, had been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything. I'd suggested we take a week-long camping trip to the Theodore Roosevelt National Park area, but Brian wanted something more isolated, more off the beaten path. He'd heard about this place from a guy at work, a stretch of badlands and prairie that supposedly offered the kind of solitude you couldn't find anywhere else. "Trust me, Kenny," Brian had said, loading his gear into my truck. "Tommy said it's like stepping back in time. No cell towers, no tourists, just us and the wilderness." Tommy Hernandez was Brian's supervisor at the power company, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd grown up in North Dakota and claimed to know every hidden corner of the state. He'd drawn us a rough map on a napkin during their lunch break, marking landmarks that would guide us to what he called the last untouched place in Dakota. The drive from Bismarck took us through increasingly desolate country, past Killdeer, past Grassy Butte, until we were following dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS had given up hours ago, showing only blank space where we were supposedly traveling. Brian navigated using Tommy's crude map and a worn road atlas from 1987 that he'd found in his grandfather's garage. "Left at the dead cottonwood," Brian read from the napkin. "Should be coming up soon." The tree stood like a twisted monument against the gray October sky, its branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. We turned onto what was barely more than a game trail, rocks pinging against the undercarriage of my truck as we bounced through ruts and washouts. The landscape around us was hauntingly beautiful in its emptiness. Rolling hills covered in brown grass stretched to the horizon, broken by gullies and coulees that cut deep scars into the earth. In the distance, the Little Missouri River wound through the Badlands like a dark snake, its banks lined with skeletal trees preparing for winter. "There," Brian pointed ahead. "That has to be it." The hollow opened before us like a wound in the earth. It was a natural depression about half a mile wide, surrounded by steep hills that rose up like the walls of an amphitheater. At the bottom, a thin stream wandered between stands of ash and elm trees, their leaves already fallen and carpeting the ground in shades of rust and gold. We made camp in a clearing near the stream, setting up our tents about 20 yards apart. Brian had insisted on bringing his grandfather's old canvas tent, a massive thing that required a dozen stakes and guy lines to secure properly. I stuck with my modern backpacking tent, lightweight and designed for the kind of weather we might encounter. The first 2 days were exactly what we'd hoped for. We hiked the surrounding hills, fished the stream, though we caught nothing, and sat around our campfire at night sharing stories and drinking the whiskey Brian had smuggled in his pack. The silence was profound. No traffic, no aircraft, no human sounds at all except for our own voices. Even the wind seemed muted down in the hollow, as if the hills absorbed all sound before it could escape. It was on the third night that things began to feel wrong. I'd gone to bed around 10, exhausted from a long day of exploring. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, and I'd burrowed deep into my sleeping bag, listening to the soft sounds of Brian moving around outside. He was a night owl, often staying up hours after I'd turned in. I woke sometime later to absolute silence. The absence of sound was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant owl calls, nothing. I lay in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake, straining to hear anything at all. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. I unzipped my tent and peered outside. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see Brian's tent across the clearing. It looked wrong somehow, though I couldn't immediately say why. Then I realized it was completely still, no gentle movement from his breathing, no soft sounds of shifting in his sleep. "Brian," I called softly. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of my tent. The cold hit me immediately, far colder than it should have been. My breath came out in thick clouds, and frost had formed on the grass around our campsite. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since I'd gone to sleep. "Brian, you okay?" I approached his tent, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The canvas hung slack and motionless. I could see through the thin material that there was no shape inside, no bulk of a sleeping body. The tent was empty. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the zipper. It had been opened from the inside, the fabric pushed outward as if someone had left in a hurry. Brian's sleeping bag lay unzipped and abandoned, still warm to the touch when I reached inside. I called his name into the darkness, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space of the hollow. The sound seemed to bounce back wrong, distorted and hollow, as if it had traveled much farther than the surrounding hills before returning to me. Brian was an experienced outdoorsman. He wouldn't just wander off in the middle of the night without telling me. He wouldn't leave his tent unzipped in freezing weather, and he certainly wouldn't abandon his boots, which I found lined up neatly outside his tent as if he'd stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling his name and following my flashlight beam through the skeletal trees along the stream. The beam seemed weaker than it should have been, barely penetrating the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. Finally, exhausted and increasingly frightened, I returned to camp. I built up the fire and sat beside it, rifle across my knees, watching the darkness and waiting for dawn. Brian returned just as the first pale light began to filter into the hollow. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Soft, measured steps coming through the trees from the direction of the stream. Relief flooded through me as his familiar silhouette emerged from the shadows. He was fully dressed, wearing his hiking boots and heavy jacket, as if he'd never been missing at all. "Jesus, Brian, where the hell have you been?" I stood up, anger and relief mixing in my voice. "I've been looking for you all night." Brian stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at me. That's when I noticed his eyes. They were completely black. Not just the pupils. The entire visible part of his eyes had become a deep, lightless black that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. He was smiling, but it was wrong, somehow. Too wide. Too many teeth showing. "I went for a walk," he said, and his voice was exactly the same as always. Same tone, same slight Midwestern accent. But the words felt empty, like sounds made by something that didn't understand their meaning. "Brian, your eyes." I took a step backward, my hand tightening on the rifle. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, they were normal. Hazel green, just as they'd always been. The too wide smile faded to his usual easy grin. "What about them?" He looked genuinely confused. "Kenny, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Where did you go?" I demanded. "Your tent was empty. Your boots were outside. You left in the middle of the night without saying anything." Brian frowned, looking down at his feet. He was wearing his boots. "I don't know what you're talking about. I slept through the night. Hell of a weird dream, though." He shook his head. "Thought I heard someone calling my name." I wanted to believe him. The rational part of my mind insisted that I must have been mistaken about what I'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the firelight, shadows playing across his face. Maybe I'd been more asleep than I thought when I'd checked his tent. Maybe the stress of the wilderness and the cold had made me see things that weren't there. But I couldn't shake the memory of those black eyes. The fourth day started normally enough. Brian seemed completely himself, making jokes over breakfast, discussing our plans for hiking the eastern ridge. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than he'd been since we'd arrived. The haunted look that had been in his eyes since his wife left him was gone. replaced by an almost childlike contentment. We broke camp late morning and hiked up out of the hollow to explore the surrounding badlands. The day was unseasonably warm, the sun burning off the morning frost and heating the air until we had to shed our jackets. We found Native American petroglyphs carved into a sandstone outcrop, ancient spirals and animal figures that seemed to watch us as we photographed them. Tommy wasn't kidding about this place being untouched, Brian said, running his fingers over the carved symbols. These could be hundreds of years old. Or thousands, I replied, though something about the petroglyphs made me uneasy. They weren't like the typical Plains Indian rock art I'd seen in museums. These symbols seemed somehow darker, more angular, as if they'd been carved by different hands entirely. We spent the afternoon exploring a network of caves that had been carved into the hillside by wind and water over millennia. Brian seemed fascinated by them, disappearing into the deeper passages while I stayed near the entrances. There was something about the caves that set my teeth on edge, a mustiness that went beyond mere age, and a sense of being watched from the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. "Kenny, you have to see this," Brian's voice echoed from somewhere deep in the cave system. I followed the sound of his voice, my flashlight beam dancing across limestone walls that were smooth as glass. The passage sloped downward, twisting and turning until I'd lost all sense of direction. The air grew colder as I descended, and I began to notice scratches in the stone, long, parallel gouges that looked almost like claw marks. I found Brian in a circular chamber about the size of a small room. He was standing in the center, turning slowly in place, his flashlight beam playing across the walls. "Look at this," he whispered. The walls were covered in markings similar to the petroglyphs we'd found outside, but these were different, newer, carved deeper into the stone with tools rather than primitive implements. And they formed a pattern, spirals and symbols that seemed to flow into each other, creating a design that hurt to look at directly. At the center of it all, carved into the floor of the chamber, was a perfect circle. Inside the circle were symbols I didn't recognize, surrounding what looked like a stylized human figure. But the figure was wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with arms and legs that were jointed in places they shouldn't be. "We should go," I said. "This place gives me the creeps." "Just a minute." Brian knelt beside the carved circle, running his hands over the symbols. "I think this is some kind of ritual site, maybe Lakota or Dakota, from before the reservations. Brian, come on, it's getting late." But he wasn't listening. He was tracing the symbols with his finger, his lips moving silently as if he were trying to pronounce words in a language he didn't understand. That's when his flashlight went out. Mine followed a second later, plunging us into absolute darkness. "Kenny?" Brian's voice came from somewhere to my left, though I could have sworn he'd been directly in front of me. "Right here." I fumbled for my spare flashlight, my hands shaking as I searched through my jacket pockets. My light died. Mine too. Must be the cold affecting the batteries. I found my backup light and clicked it on. Nothing happened. I tried again, twisting the end cap, checking the batteries. Dead. "This is impossible," I muttered. "These are brand new batteries." "Kenny?" Brian's voice again, but now it seemed to come from deeper in the cave, farther away than he should have been able to travel in the few seconds we'd been in darkness. "Brian, where are you?" "I'm right here. Can't you see me?" I couldn't see anything. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eyes like a physical weight. I reached out in the direction where Brian's voice had come from and felt nothing but empty air. "Brian, talk to me. Keep talking so I can find you." Silence. I began moving forward carefully, one hand stretched out in front of me, the other trailing along the wall. The stone felt different under my fingers, rougher, as if the smooth limestone had been replaced by something else entirely. And it was getting colder. My breath came out in clouds I couldn't see, and frost began forming on my jacket. "Brian!" My voice echoed strangely, bouncing back and forth between walls that seemed much farther apart than they had been moments before. The chamber felt enormous now, as if it had stretched and expanded while we were in darkness. I kept moving, following the wall, trying to find the passage that had led us into the chamber, but the wall curved wrong, turning in directions that didn't match my memory of the space. I should have reached the entrance by now, should have felt the narrowing that marked the beginning of the tunnel back to the surface. Instead, the wall simply continued, curving endlessly away into the dark. I don't know how long I wandered in that darkness. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to move differently in the cave, stretching and contracting like a rubber band. Several times I thought I heard Brian's voice calling to me, but it always seemed to come from a different direction, and when I followed it, I found nothing. Finally, impossibly, I saw light ahead. It was pale and cold, like moonlight, though we'd entered the caves in the middle of the afternoon. I stumbled toward it, desperate to escape the pressing darkness, and found myself emerging from a cave mouth I didn't recognize. I was standing on a hillside I'd never seen before, looking down into a valley that wasn't the hollow. The landscape stretched out before me under a sky full of stars, though the sun had been shining when we'd entered the caves. In the distance, I could see lights, the warm yellow glow of windows and campfires. It was our camp, but it looked wrong. The tents were in the wrong places, and there seemed to be more of them than there should have been. Smoke rose from multiple fires, and I could hear voices carried on the wind, laughter and conversation from what sounded like a large group of people. But Brian and I were alone out here. We hadn't seen another soul since leaving the main road 3 days ago. I made my way down the hillside, moving carefully in the strange, pale light. As I got closer to the camp, the wrongness became more apparent. The tents were old-fashioned canvas models like Brian's grandfather's, but there were at least a dozen of them arranged in a rough circle around a large central fire. People moved between them, shadowy figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence as I watched. I crept closer, staying low behind a stand of dead trees at the edge of the clearing. The people around the fire looked normal enough at first glance, men and women in camping clothes talking quietly and passing a bottle between them. But there was something off about their movements, something too fluid and graceful, as if they were floating just slightly above the ground, and their eyes, when they turned toward the fire, the light reflected off their eyes like an animal's, creating twin points of silver that gleamed in the darkness. One of them was Brian. He sat cross-legged on a log, staring into the flames with that same too wide smile I'd seen earlier. But now I could see what was wrong with it. His mouth was open slightly, and I could see too many teeth, rows of them, sharp and white like a shark's. As I watched, he turned his head toward my hiding place with mechanical precision, as if he could sense my presence. Those silver-bright eyes fixed on mine across the darkness, and his smile widened impossibly further. "Kenny," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Why don't you join us?" The other figures around the fire turned to look at me, all of them wearing that same terrible smile. They began to stand, moving with that same unnatural grace, and I could see that they weren't quite human anymore. Their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs bent at impossible angles, fingers that stretched into claw-like points. I ran. I crashed through the dead trees and up the hillside, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but moving with that eerie, floating gait that somehow kept pace with my panicked sprint. I reached the cave mouth and plunged back into the darkness without thinking, preferring the unknown terrors of the cave system to whatever those things around the fire had become. The darkness embraced me like an old friend, and I stumbled forward blindly, one hand trailing along the wall, following passages that seemed to shift and change around me. This time, I found my way out more quickly. When I emerged from the caves, it was into the familiar landscape of the hollow, with our actual campsite visible in the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, though I could have sworn it had been midday when we'd entered the caves. Brian was sitting by our campfire poking at the flames with a stick. He looked up as I approached and his eyes were normal, hazel green and concerned. "There you are," he said. "I was starting to worry. You disappeared in that cave system. Took me forever to find my way out." "How long was I gone?" I asked, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Brian checked his watch. "Maybe an hour. Hard to tell in those caves. Felt like longer." I stared at him, searching for any sign of the thing I'd seen around that impossible campfire. But he seemed completely normal, tired, dirty from our cave exploration, and increasingly worried about my behavior. "Kenny, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The same words he'd used that morning, delivered in exactly the same tone. I spent that night awake, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my knees, watching Brian sleep in his tent. Every so often, I'd see movement in the shadows at the edge of the firelight, shapes that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. But they never came closer, and Brian slept peacefully through the night. When morning came, I suggested we pack up and head home. I'd had enough of the hollow and its impossible geography, enough of caves that led to places that shouldn't exist, and friends who returned from the darkness changed. But Brian wanted to stay another day. "Come on, Kenny," he said over breakfast. "We just got here, and this place is incredible. I feel more relaxed than I have in months." That was exactly what worried me. The Brian I knew had been wound tight as a spring since his divorce proceedings started. The idea that a few days of camping would completely cure his anxiety didn't make sense. "I think we should go," I insisted. "Weather's supposed to turn bad tomorrow." "Since when do you worry about weather? Remember that storm in Montana when we had to hunker down for 3 days? That was the best camping trip we ever took." He was right, and we both knew it. The old me would have laughed off a little bad weather. But the old me hadn't spent the night watching my best friend sleep and wondering if the thing in the tent was really him. In the end, we compromised. We'd stay one more night, but we'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Brian seemed satisfied with this arrangement and spent the day in unusually high spirits. He hummed while he did camp chores, smiled constantly, and kept suggesting activities that would keep us in the hollow longer. "Let's explore that creek bed upstream," he said after lunch. "I bet there are Native American artifacts up there." "Let's climb to the top of the eastern ridge," he suggested later. "The view from up there must be incredible." Each suggestion felt like a test, as if he were trying to lure me deeper into the hollow's influence. I declined them all, making excuses about being tired or wanting to rest before our long drive home. As evening approached, I began to feel a familiar sense of wrongness. The shadows seemed to fall differently than they had the previous nights, creating pockets of darkness that felt solid and impenetrable. The temperature dropped faster than it should have, and the wind carried sounds that might have been voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. "I'm going to gather some firewood," Brian announced as the sun touched the western hills. "I'll come with you," I said immediately. "No need, there's plenty of deadfall just upstream. I'll be back in a few minutes." He walked away before I could protest, disappearing into the trees along the creek. I watched him go, noting the casual way he moved, as if he had no concerns about what might be waiting in the darkness. I gave him 10 minutes, then followed. I found his tracks easily enough in the soft soil along the stream bank. They led upstream for about 100 yards before veering off into a thick stand of trees. I followed them carefully, my rifle ready, stopping every few steps to listen for sounds of movement ahead. The tracks led to a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a circle of bare earth about 20 feet across. The ground was packed hard and smooth, as if many feet had walked the same path over and over for years. At the center of the circle was a pile of stones arranged in a pattern I recognized from the cave. The same spirals and angular symbols that had hurt to look at directly. Brian knelt beside the stone arrangement, but he wasn't gathering firewood. Instead, he was placing objects around the stones, personal items from our camp. His grandfather's compass, my spare batteries, the whiskey bottle we'd been sharing, even our truck keys. "Brian, what are you doing?" He looked up at me with those black eyes again. the ones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His smile was the one I'd seen in the vision of the false camp, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Preparing," he said in a voice that was his but not his. "They've been waiting so long, Kenny. Waiting for someone to complete the circle." "Who's been waiting?" "The ones who were here first. Before the Lakota, before the Mandan, before any human foot touched this ground. They carved the symbols in the stone, made this place holy, but they needed something more to return." He gestured to the arranged objects, and I could see now that they formed the same pattern as the carving in the cave floor. Our possessions had become components in some kind of ritual that had been planned long before we'd ever heard of the Hollow. "They needed blood," Brian continued, "and flesh, and minds to carry their thoughts back into the world." "Brian, you're scaring me. This isn't you talking." "Of course it is." His smile widened further, stretching his face in ways that should have been impossible. "I'm still Brian Wright, 30 years old, from Fargo, North Dakota. Divorced, depressed, desperate for a change in my life. They just gave me what I needed." He stood up slowly, and I could see that his proportions were wrong. His arms hung too low, his fingers were too long, and when he moved, it was with that same floating gait I'd seen in the vision of the false camp. "They want you to join us, Kenny. You've been alone so long, carrying the weight of everyone else's problems. Your mother's cancer, your father's drinking, my divorce. You absorb it all and never let anyone help you carry the load. They can take that burden away." He was right about that, and it scared me more than his transformed appearance. I had always been the one people came to with their problems, the one who listened and offered advice and never asked for anything in return. It was exhausting, being everyone's rock, but I'd never told anyone that. "How do they know about my mother?" I demanded. "They know everything about you. They've been watching since you were a child, waiting for you to become strong enough to serve them. All those times you felt like someone was watching you from the dark corners of your room. All those nightmares about being chased through empty corridors, that was them, learning who you are." The memories he was describing were real, but they were private. Childhood fears I'd never shared with anyone, not even Brian. The thing wearing my friend's face shouldn't have known about them. "What happened to Brian? The real Brian?" "He's still here," the thing said, tapping its chest with one elongated finger. "He's just improved, enhanced, given purpose beyond his small human concerns. Bring him back." "I can't do that, but I can offer you the same gift. No more loneliness, Kenny. No more carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. They'll take all of that away, and in return, you'll help them reclaim what was stolen from them." What was stolen? This world. Humanity pushed them back into the dark places, into caves and forgotten hollows. But they were here first. They have a right to walk under the sun again. The thing that had been Brian began moving toward me, its movements becoming less human with each step. I could see now that its skin had taken on a grayish pallor and its hair was falling out in patches, revealing scalp that was covered in those same angular symbols from the cave. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. "You won't shoot me," it said confidently. "I'm still your friend, still the person who helped you through your father's funeral, who listened to you cry about Sarah leaving you, who's been your closest companion for 8 years." It was right. Despite everything I'd seen, despite the certainty that this thing was no longer Brian, I couldn't pull the trigger. The face was still his, even transformed as it was. The voice was still his, even speaking words he would never say. "They don't want to hurt you," it continued, now only a few feet away. "They just want you to understand, to see the truth of what this world really is." It reached out with one of its elongated hands, and I could see that the fingers ended in black claws that looked sharp enough to cut through bone. "Let me show you," it whispered. The claws touched my forehead, and suddenly I was somewhere else. I stood in the hollow as it had been centuries ago, before any European had set foot on the continent. But it wasn't empty. Figures moved through the trees, tall, angular things that were almost human, but not quite. They tended fires that burned with cold blue flames and carved symbols into the living rock with tools made from materials I couldn't identify. This was their place, their sacred ground. They had built their civilization here in the hidden places of the world, away from the sun that hurt their eyes and the open spaces that left them exposed. For thousands of years, they had lived in harmony with the few humans who knew of their existence, taking only what they needed and giving back knowledge that helped the tribes survive the harsh winters and harsh land. But then the world changed. New people came from across the water, people who didn't understand the old agreements, who saw the dark places as empty and available for taking. The things that lived in the hollow were driven deeper underground, into caves and forgotten places, waiting for a chance to reclaim what had been theirs. The vision shifted, and I saw Tommy Hernandez as a young man, camping in this same spot with his grandfather. I watched as his grandfather performed a ritual similar to the one Brian had been preparing, offering personal objects to the stones and speaking words in a language that predated all human speech. Tommy's grandfather had been a guardian, one of the few humans who still remembered the old agreements. He had fed the things in the hollow, bringing them offerings and keeping their memory alive. But he was old, and when he died, the knowledge had died with him. Except for the map, the crude drawing on a napkin that had led us here. The vision faded, and I was back in the clearing with the thing that wore Brian's face. But now I understood. Tommy hadn't sent us here for a relaxing camping trip. He'd sent us here as offerings, as payment for an ancient debt that his family had inherited. "You see," the thing said, "this was always the plan. Tommy's grandfather made promises that Tommy couldn't keep, so he found substitutes. 2 young men, healthy and strong, perfect vessels for their return to the world. I should have been terrified. I should have been running or fighting or screaming. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The weight I'd been carrying for so long, the responsibility for everyone else's happiness, the constant worry about things beyond my control, was lifting away like smoke. "It doesn't have to hurt," the thing continued. "The transformation is actually quite peaceful. You'll still be you, just more than you were before." I could feel it then, the presence that had been watching from the shadows. They were all around us now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Tall figures with too many joints and eyes that reflected starlight. They had been waiting in the dark places for so long, and now they were ready to come home. The claws touched my forehead again, and I felt something cold and ancient flowing into my mind. Knowledge that hurt to think about, memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity had even learned to use fire. They didn't want to destroy humanity, I realized. They wanted to improve it, to give it purpose beyond its small, selfish concerns. The loneliness that had haunted me my entire life could be replaced by connection to something vast and timeless. All I had to do was let go. The rifle fell from my hands as my knees buckled. The cold presence in my mind grew stronger, pushing out thoughts that were purely my own and replacing them with alien desires. I could feel my body beginning to change, bones lengthening and joints popping as they rearranged themselves into more efficient configurations. It felt like coming home, but then I heard something that cut through the alien presence like a knife. My mother's voice, calling my name the way she had when I was a child and had wandered too far from the house. "Kenny! Kenny, where are you?" The memory was so vivid it felt real. I was 7 years old again, lost in the woods behind our house, following a stream that I thought would lead me to adventure. But it had only led me deeper into the trees, farther from home, until the sun was setting and I was alone and scared. My mother had found me just as the last light was fading from the sky. She'd been calling my name for hours, her voice growing hoarse and desperate. When she saw me, she'd dropped to her knees and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "I thought I'd lost you," she'd whispered into my hair. "I thought you were gone forever." The memory of that hug, of that overwhelming relief and love burned through the alien presence in my mind like acid. This thing wanted to take me away from that love, to replace it with cold knowledge and ancient hungers. It wanted to make me forget everyone who had ever mattered to me. I fought back. The presence recoiled, surprised by the strength of my resistance. For a moment, I was myself again, standing in the clearing with the thing that had been Brian reaching toward me with its claws extended. I dove for the rifle. The thing moved faster than anything human should have been able to move, but I had the advantage of desperation. My fingers closed around the rifle's stock just as those claws raked across my back, tearing through my jacket and the shirt beneath. I rolled, came up with the rifle pointed at the thing's chest, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space of the clearing. The thing staggered backward, black fluid spurting from the wound in its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the hole in its body with what might have been curiosity. "That was unnecessary," it said in Brian's voice, "and ultimately pointless." The wound was already closing, the black fluid hardening into something that looked like scar tissue. Within seconds, there was no sign that I'd shot it at all. Around the edges of the clearing, I could see the other figures beginning to emerge from the trees. Dozens of them, all with that same angular, not quite human appearance. They moved slowly, confidently, as if they had all the time in the world, which I supposed they did. I backed toward the edge of the clearing, keeping the rifle trained on the thing that wore Brian's face. It followed me, matching my pace exactly, that terrible smile never wavering. "You can't run from us, Kenny," it said. "There's nowhere to go. The Hollow doesn't let people leave." It was probably right. I'd already experienced the way this place bent geography to its will, creating passages that led to impossible destinations and distances that changed depending on who was measuring them. But I had to try. I reached the tree line and turned to run, crashing through the underbrush without any clear sense of direction. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but moving with that eerie, gliding gait that somehow kept pace with my panicked flight. I ran for what felt like hours, following game trails and creek beds, climbing hills and sliding down ravines. The landscape around me kept shifting and changing, showing me vistas that couldn't possibly exist in North Dakota: tropical forests, desert canyons, Arctic tundra. The Hollow was testing me, offering me glimpses of every environment on Earth as if trying to tempt me to stop and explore. But I kept running. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of cuts and scrapes, I found myself at the edge of the Hollow. I could see my truck in the distance, parked exactly where we'd left it 4 days ago. The sight of that familiar red paint and dented bumper was enough to bring tears to my eyes. I stumbled down the slope toward the vehicle, fumbling in my pockets for the keys. But then I remembered. Brian had placed them in the circle with the other offerings. They were back in that clearing with the stone arrangement, along with our other essential supplies. The truck was useless without the keys, but maybe I could find another way. Hotwire it, maybe, or hike back to the main road and flag down help. Anything was better than staying in the Hollow and waiting for those things to find me. I was 20 yards from the truck when I saw the figure sitting in the driver's seat. It was Brian. The real Brian, not the transformed thing I'd left in the clearing. He looked exactly as he had when we'd first arrived, dressed in his favorite flannel shirt and worn jeans. When he saw me approaching, he smiled and rolled down the window. "There you are," he said. I was starting to worry. "Ready to head home?" I stopped dead in my tracks, the rifle still clutched in my hands. This had to be another trick, another illusion designed to lure me into dropping my guard. "You're not real," I said. Brian's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Kenny, what's wrong? You look terrible. And why are you carrying that rifle?" "Prove you're real. Tell me something only the real Brian would know." He thought for a moment, then grinned. "Remember sophomore year when you got food poisoning from that Chinese place near campus? You were convinced you were going to die, so you made me promise to delete your browser history if anything happened to you." The memory was real and embarrassingly accurate, but the thing in the clearing had known about my childhood fears, private thoughts I'd never shared with anyone. It could easily know about this. 2. "That's not enough," I said. "Anyone could know that story." Brian's expression darkened. "Anyone? Kenny, I'm your best friend. I've known you for 8 years. I was the best man at your wedding, for Christ's sake. I never got married." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Brian's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally something that might have been embarrassment. "Right," he said slowly. "Sarah called it off. I knew that, just got confused for a minute." But I could see it in his eyes now, the same empty quality I'd noticed in the transformed Brian. This thing knew facts about my life, but it didn't understand the emotional weight behind them. It had accessed Brian's memories without gaining Brian's heart. "Get out of my truck," I said, raising the rifle. "Kenny, please. I know this place has you spooked, but I'm really me. I'm really Brian. Whatever you think you saw back there, it wasn't real. This whole place messes with your head, makes you see things, hear things that aren't there." It was a good argument, a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. But there was one problem with it. "If you're really Brian," I said, "then where did you get the keys?" He looked down at his hands, and I could see the key ring dangling from his fingers, the same keys that I'd seen placed in the stone circle as part of the ritual. When he looked back up at me, his eyes were black again. "They want to go home," he said in a voice that was no longer trying to sound human. "They've been trapped in the dark for so long, Kenny. You have to understand, they're not evil. They're just lost." I fired without hesitation this time. The bullet took the thing in the forehead, snapping its head back against the truck's headrest. Black fluid splattered across the rear window, and for a moment, the body went completely limp. Then it began to laugh. The sound was horrible. Brian's laughter mixed with something else, something that had never been human. The thing straightened up in the driver's seat, the bullet wound already beginning to close. "You can't kill us," it said. "We're part of this place now, part of the earth itself." I backed away from the truck, looking around desperately for another escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The hollow stretched out around me in all directions, and I could see more figures emerging from the trees, dozens of them, all moving toward me with that same patient, inexorable pace. That's when I remembered the GPS, not the device in the truck, which had stopped working days ago, but the basic principle behind it. GPS worked by triangulating signals from multiple satellites, determining your position based on the time it took those signals to reach you. Time. Everything that had happened in the hollow involved some kind of temporal distortion. I'd entered the caves in midday and emerged at sunset. I'd spent hours searching for Brian in the cave system, but he claimed I'd only been gone for an hour. The vision of the false camp had taken place under a night sky when it should have been afternoon. The things that lived here didn't just bend space, they bent time as well. And if time was distorted, then maybe I could use that distortion to my advantage. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the exact moment when everything had started going wrong. Not the first night when Brian had disappeared, but earlier, the moment we'd first arrived in the hollow and set up camp. I concentrated on that memory, holding it in my mind like a photograph. The way the afternoon light had slanted through the trees, the sound of the stream running over the rocks, the smell of Brian's cigarette as he'd stood at the edge of the clearing and proclaimed it the perfect campsite. The world around me began to shift. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the same spot, but everything had changed. The light was different, warmer, more golden. The trees were fuller, their leaves not yet fallen, and in the distance I could see our camp as it had been on that first day, with our tents properly pitched and a small fire already burning. But this wasn't just a memory. I could feel the weight of the rifle in my hands, smell the cordite from the shots I'd fired. Somehow, I had actually traveled back to that first afternoon, carrying with me the knowledge of everything that was going to happen. I had a chance to change things. I ran toward the camp, calling Brian's name. I found him exactly where I remembered, standing at the edge of the clearing with a cigarette in his hand, looking out over the hollow with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Brian," I shouted, "we have to leave, right now." He turned toward me, startled by the urgency in my voice. "What's wrong? We just got here. This place is dangerous. There are things here, things that aren't human. They're going to try to take us, to change us. We have to get out before dark." Brian studied my face, taking in the cuts and bruises, the torn jacket, the rifle clutched in my hands. "Kenny, what happened to you? You look like you've been running through the woods for hours." "I have been, or I will be. It's complicated." I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the truck. "Please, just trust me. We need to leave now." But Brian pulled free, his expression shifting from concern to suspicion. "You're scaring me, man. Maybe you should sit down, have some water. You're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense." I could hear the hysteria creeping into my voice, but I couldn't stop it. This whole place is a trap. Tommy didn't send us here for a vacation. He sent us here as sacrifices. His grandfather made some kind of deal with the things that live here, and now they want us to pay the price. Brian stared at me for a long moment, then carefully stubbed out his cigarette. "Okay, let's say you're right. Let's say there are monsters in the woods and Tommy is part of some ancient conspiracy. What exactly are you proposing we do about it?" "Leave. Pack up the truck and drive back to civilization. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just get as far away from here as possible." "And then what? Report it to the authorities. Tell them we were almost eaten by ancient cave monsters in a place that doesn't exist on any map?" He had a point, but I didn't care. "I don't care if they believe us or not. I just want to get out of here alive." Brian looked around the clearing, taking in the peaceful afternoon scene, the stream babbling over the rocks, the birds singing in the trees, the golden light filtering through the leaves. Nothing about it looked threatening or supernatural. "Kenny, I think you had a bad dream. Maybe some kind of panic attack brought on by the isolation. This place is perfectly safe. Look around. It's beautiful." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was tall and thin, with pale skin and dark hair, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a different century. When it saw us, it raised one hand in what might have been a greeting. "Who's that?" Brian asked, squinting across the distance. I raised the rifle without thinking, sighting down the barrel at the figure's chest. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the weapon steady. "Kenny, what the hell are you doing?" Brian grabbed the rifle's barrel, trying to push it down. "That's just another camper." "That's not a camper," I said through gritted teeth. "That's one of them." The figure began walking toward us, moving with that same floating gait I'd seen in my visions. As it got closer, I could see that its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs jointed in places they shouldn't be. But Brian didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He waved back at the approaching figure, smiling broadly. "Hello there," he called out. "Beautiful afternoon, isn't it?" The figure smiled back, revealing too many teeth, and when it spoke, its voice carried clearly across the clearing despite the distance. "Yes," it said. "Perfect weather for a sacrifice." That's when Brian finally saw what I was seeing. The color drained from his face as he took in the figure's inhuman features, the way it moved without quite touching the ground. "What the fuck is that thing?" he whispered. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," I said. "This whole place is full of them." More figures began emerging from the trees around the clearing. Dozens of them, all with that same pale, angular appearance. They moved slowly but purposefully, forming a loose circle around our camp. "The truck," Brian said. "We need to get to the truck." But when we turned toward where we'd parked, there was another figure standing directly in our path. This one looked almost human except for its eyes, which were completely black and seemed to absorb the afternoon light. "You cannot leave," it said in a voice like wind through empty caves. "The debt must be paid." I raised the rifle again, but before I could fire, the world around me began to shift and blur. The golden afternoon light faded to gray, The trees withered and lost their leaves, and the stream's cheerful babbling became a low, mournful moan. We were back where we'd started, in the hollow as it really was, dark and cold and full of hungry shadows. "Time is a circle here," the figure with the black eyes said. "You can visit the past, but you cannot change it. What has been done cannot be undone." Brian stood beside me, but he was no longer the Brian who had waved at the approaching figure. This was the transformed Brian, the one with the too wide smile and the elongated limbs. "You tried to warn me," he said conversationally. "I appreciate that. It shows you really care about our friendship." "Bring him back," I demanded, keeping the rifle trained on the circle of figures surrounding us. "Bring back the real Brian." "He's still here," the thing wearing Brian's face said. "Just improved. Would you like to speak with him?" For a moment, the alien presence seemed to recede, and I saw a flicker of the real Brian in those black eyes. He looked confused and frightened, like someone waking from a long, strange dream. "Kenny?" His voice was weak, distant, but unmistakably his own. "Where are we? What happened to me?" "You're in the hollow," I said. "These things, they've done something to you, changed you, but you're still in there somewhere." I can't remember how I got here. Everything's so dark and cold." His face contorted with effort as if he were fighting against invisible restraints. "They're in my head, Kenny. I can hear them whispering, telling me things about the world, about what humans really are." "Fight them," I urged. "You're stronger than they are." "No," he said sadly. "I'm not. They've been here so much longer than we have. They know things about existence that would drive us insane if we really understood them. The only way to survive the knowledge is to become something else. Then don't survive it. Stay human." Brian, the real Brian, smiled at that, and for a moment he looked exactly like his old self. "You always were the optimist. Even when Sarah left you, even when your dad was drinking himself to death, you never gave up hope. I'm not giving up hope now. You should." The alien presence reasserted itself and Brian's face became inhuman again. "Because this conversation is over." The circle of figures began closing in, moving with that patient, inexorable pace. I could see now that there were more of them than I'd initially realized. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all emerging from the trees and shadows to witness whatever was about to happen. I had 3 rounds left in the rifle. Not nearly enough. But maybe I didn't need to kill them all. Maybe I just needed to disrupt whatever ritual they were trying to perform. I turned the rifle away from the approaching figures and pointed it at the stone arrangement in the center of the clearing, the spiral pattern that seemed to be the focus of their power. "Stop," I called out. "One more step and I destroy your altar." The figures paused, and I could see uncertainty in their inhuman faces. The one with the black eyes took a step forward. "You don't understand what you're threatening," it said. "That arrangement has taken centuries to complete. It's the anchor that allows us to exist in this reality." "Good," I said. "Then you'll understand why I'm going to destroy it. If you damage the anchor, you'll trap yourself here forever. The hollow will become your prison, just as it has been ours. Better trapped than transformed." I was about to pull the trigger when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the distant rumble of a truck engine. We all turned toward the sound, and I could see headlights cutting through the darkness beyond the trees. Someone was driving down the old dirt road toward the hollow, following the same route Brian and I had taken 4 days ago. "Fresh offerings," the figure with black eyes said with satisfaction. "The debt grows larger each year, but there are always those willing to pay it." The truck appeared at the edge of the clearing, a battered pickup not unlike my own, with 2 figures visible in the cab. As I watched, it came to a stop exactly where we had parked and the occupants climbed out. They were young men, probably college age, dressed in camping gear and carrying backpacks. They looked around the clearing with the same expression of wonder that Brian and I had worn when we'd first arrived. "Perfect spot," one of them said to the other. "Tommy wasn't kidding about this place being hidden." Tommy? Of course it was Tommy. I realized then that this was how it worked. Every few years, Tommy would send another group of unsuspecting victims to the Hollow, payment for an ancient debt that could never be fully settled. And each time, the things that lived here would grow a little stronger, a little more capable of extending their influence into the world beyond. The two young men began unloading their gear, completely oblivious to the dozens of inhuman figures watching them from the shadows. They couldn't see them yet. The creatures would remain hidden until their victims were fully committed to staying, just as they had with Brian and me. "Let them go," I said to the figure with black eyes. "Take me instead. One willing sacrifice has to be worth more than two reluctant ones." "Admirable," the figure said, "but unnecessary. We have use for all of you." That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The things in the Hollow weren't content to simply collect occasional offerings from Tommy's hunting trips. They were building an army. Every person who disappeared in this place, every camper or hiker who was reported missing in the remote areas of North Dakota, became another soldier in their invisible war against humanity. They were patient creatures, willing to work on a timescale that spanned centuries. But they had a goal. They wanted their world back. I looked at the two young men setting up their camp, blissfully unaware of what was waiting for them in the darkness. In a few hours, they would be just like Brian, transformed into something that looked human but served an alien agenda. Unless I could stop it, I made my decision. Instead of aiming at the stone arrangement, I turned the rifle toward the fuel tank of the newcomer's truck. If I could create enough of an explosion, maybe it would disrupt whatever ritual the creatures were planning. Maybe it would even damage their anchor. But before I could fire, the figure with black eyes moved faster than anything human should have been able to move. One moment it was standing 20 feet away. The next, its elongated fingers were wrapped around the rifle's barrel. "I think not," it said. With casual ease, it twisted the weapon out of my hands and tossed it aside. Then it grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off the ground with impossible strength. "You've caused enough disruption," it said as my vision began to gray around the edges. "Time to join your friend." I felt the cold presence flooding into my mind again, but this time it was stronger, more insistent. It pushed aside my thoughts and memories like a flood, sweeping away everything in its path. I could feel my own personality dissolving, being replaced by something vast and ancient and utterly alien. But just before I lost myself completely, I heard something that gave me hope. Gunshots. Not the careful, aimed shots of an experienced hunter, but the rapid, panicked firing of someone who had just seen something that shouldn't exist. The two young men had finally noticed the figures surrounding their camp, and they were fighting back. The creature holding me jerked as if stung, and its grip on my throat loosened slightly. The alien presence in my mind wavered, distracted by whatever was happening across the clearing. I used that moment of distraction to do the only thing I could think of. I bit down on the creature's wrist as hard as I could. The taste of its blood was indescribable, like copper and electricity and something else that had no earthly equivalent. But the creature shrieked and dropped me, clutching its wounded wrist against its chest. Black fluid spurted from the bite wound, but instead of clotting like it had when I'd shot the transformed Brian, it continued to flow. The creature stared at the wound with what might have been amazement. "How?" it whispered. I didn't know how, but I could guess. These things could shrug off bullets and other physical injuries, but they couldn't defend against something that came from inside, something that carried a piece of their own essence. When I'd bitten the creature, I'd tasted its blood. And somehow, that had given me access to whatever power allowed them to heal and transform. I could feel it now, flowing through my veins like liquid fire, but instead of trying to change me into something else, it was making me more myself, more human, more determined, more capable of resisting their influence. The creature with black eyes was backing away from me, still clutching its bleeding wrist. Around the clearing, the other figures had turned their attention away from the two young men and were focusing on me with expressions of what might have been fear. "You cannot have our power," the wounded creature said. "You are not one of us." "No," I agreed. I'm something else. I reached out with my newfound abilities and felt the ebb and flow of time around me. Not just the linear progression that humans experienced, but the complex currents and eddies that these creatures use to navigate between different moments. And I found the moment I was looking for. The exact instant when Brian and I had first driven into the hollow, when we were still innocent and unaware of what waited for us in the darkness. But this time, instead of just visiting that moment, I reached out and grabbed it, pulling it toward the present like a fisherman reeling in a line. The world around me began to shift and blur, but this time it wasn't just my perception that was changing. It was reality itself. The clearing flickered between different temporal states like a broken television switching channels. One moment, it was full of ancient creatures and transformed humans. The next, it was empty except for falling leaves and afternoon sunlight. I concentrated harder, pouring all my will into maintaining the connection to that first moment of arrival. The alien power in my veins responded, giving me the strength to hold multiple timelines in tension. And slowly, impossibly, I began to overwrite the present with the past. The creatures fought back. Of course, they poured their own power into maintaining the timeline they had created, the one where they had successfully lured Brian and me into their trap. But they were weakened by my unexpected resistance, and the bite wound in their leader's wrist continued to bleed, draining their collective strength. The battle was fought not with weapons or physical force, but with competing visions of reality. They showed me a world where humanity had never evolved beyond its primitive state, where their kind ruled over empty landscapes under alien stars. I countered with memories of everything I loved about being human: my mother's laugh, the smell of coffee on a cold morning, the way Brian had looked when he'd gotten his first job after college. Gradually, my version of reality began to win. The creatures faded like shadows at dawn, their forms becoming translucent and insubstantial. The stone arrangement in the center of the clearing crumbled to dust, its carefully carved symbols erasing themselves as if they had never existed. And Brian, my real friend, unchanged and unaware, stood at the edge of the clearing with a cigarette in his hand, looking out over the hollow with an expression of deep satisfaction. "This is perfect," he said, just as he had the first time. Tommy wasn't kidding about this place being special. But this time, I was ready for him. "Actually," I said, walking up beside him, "I think we should keep looking. This place gives me a bad feeling." Brian looked at me with surprise. "Really? It seems ideal to me. Plenty of water, natural windbreak, level ground for the tents." "Trust me on this one," I said. "Let's find somewhere else." For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. The original timeline exerted a kind of gravitational pull, trying to drag events back toward their predetermined conclusion. But then Brian shrugged and flicked his cigarette into the stream. "You're the boss," he said. "Your truck, your trip." We packed up our gear and drove out of the hollow without looking back. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the road to disappear, or for the truck to break down, or for those pale figures to come walking out of the trees. But nothing happened. We simply drove away, leaving the place to its ancient solitude. Later, after we'd found a different campsite in the official national park boundaries, Brian asked me why I'd changed my mind about the hollow. "Just didn't feel right," I told him. "Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." He accepted that explanation without question, but I could see him watching me sometimes over the next few days. I was different now, more alert, more decisive, more willing to trust my own judgment even when I couldn't explain my reasoning. The alien power had faded from my system within hours of leaving the hollow, but it had left behind a kind of residual awareness. I could sense things that didn't belong, places where reality was thin enough for other things to bleed through, and I knew that the hollow was still out there, waiting. When we got back to Bismarck, I went to see Tommy Hernandez at the power company. I found him in the break room, eating lunch and reading a newspaper, looking like any other middle-aged worker. "Kenny," he said when he saw me. "How was the trip? Did you find the place I told you about?" "We found it," I said, "but we didn't stay." Something flickered in Tommy's eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or fear. Why not? I told you it was special. It was special. All right, so special that I think you should stop sending people there. Tommy set down his sandwich and looked at me carefully. I don't know what you're talking about. Your grandfather made a deal, I said, a long time ago, and you've been keeping up your end by sending fresh victims to the Hollow every few years. But it ends now. You don't understand, Tommy said quietly. If the offerings stop, they'll come looking for them. They'll come into the towns, the cities. Is that what you want? Let them come, I said. At least then people will see them for what they really are. Tommy shook his head. You have no idea what you're risking. They've been patient because they've been fed. But if they get hungry enough, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I won't be party to sending any more innocent people to that place. I turned to leave, but Tommy called after me. They marked you, didn't they? That's how you got away. They gave you just enough power to escape, but they'll be able to find you anywhere now. You can't hide from them. I paused at the door, considering his words. He was probably right. The creatures in the Hollow had resources I couldn't even imagine, and they had all the time in the world to plan their revenge. But that was a problem for future me to solve. Maybe they marked me, I said, but I mark them too, and next time we meet, I'll be ready. I walked out of the power company and drove home, where I spent the evening researching everything I could find about the Hollow and the surrounding area. Most of what I found was useless. Geological surveys and topographical maps that showed nothing unusual about the region. But buried in the archives of the State Historical Society, I found references to a place the Mandan people had called the Hungry Ground, an area they avoided during their seasonal migrations because it was said to steal the souls of those who camped there. The last mention of it was in a journal kept by a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Abraham Lincoln in the 1870s. He wrote about a patrol that had gone missing in the Badlands, and how the local scouts had refused to search for them in a particular valley because it was claimed by the old ones. The patrol was never found. I made copies of everything I could find and stored them in a safety deposit box, along with a detailed account of everything that had happened to Brian and me in the Hollow. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. I went back to my job, Brian went through with his divorce, and life returned to something resembling normal. Except for the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the Hollow, not nightmares exactly, but visions of that place as it existed outside of normal time and space. I saw the creatures going about their ancient business, tending fires that burned with cold flames and carving new symbols into the living rock. And sometimes I saw other people, hikers and campers who had found their way to that hidden valley despite my efforts to warn Tommy away from sending them. The creatures were still feeding, still growing stronger, still preparing for whatever larger plan they had in mind. In my dreams, they would look up from their work and smile at me with too many teeth, as if they knew I was watching, as if they were happy to let me see what was coming, because they knew, as I was beginning to understand, that there was nothing I could do to stop them. I had saved Brian. I had saved myself. But the Hollow was still out there, patient and hungry and eternal, and someday they would come for the rest of us. But until that day, I would be ready. I would keep watching, keep learning, keep preparing for the war that was coming whether humanity knew it or not, because someone had to stand guard against the darkness. And apparently that someone was me. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 23 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, South Dakota, during what was supposed to be our final camping trip before graduation. The idea came from Jake Morrison, my roommate since freshman year. "One last hurrah," he'd said, spreading a topographical map across our dorm room floor. His finger traced the jagged lines marking the little Missouri River where it carved through the painted canyons. 3 days in the real wilderness. No cell towers, no tourists, just us and the Badlands. Sarah Chen had been skeptical from the start. She'd grown up in Minneapolis and preferred her nature experiences to include hot showers and room service. But when Jake's girlfriend Emma Rodriguez jumped on board, Sarah caved. "Fine," she'd said, "but I'm bringing enough granola bars to feed a small army." The fifth member of our group was Tommy Kowalski, Jake's high school buddy who'd driven down from Fargo. Tommy was the kind of guy who collected vintage horror movies and claimed he could survive a zombie apocalypse. His overconfidence should have been our first warning. We drove into the park on a Thursday morning in early October, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the cottonwoods along the river look like they'd been dipped in gold. Jake had secured a backcountry permit for the Achenbach Trail area, a section of the park where motorized vehicles weren't allowed and camping required a 2-mile hike from the nearest access road. "This is perfect," Jake said as we shouldered our packs at the trailhead. The parking area was empty except for our 2 cars, Jake's beat-up Subaru and Tommy's pickup. Complete isolation. The trail wound through stands of Rocky Mountain juniper and across prairie grassland that stretched to the horizon. In the distance, the eroded buttes and pinnacles of the Badlands rose like ancient monuments, their layered rock faces painted in shades of rust and cream. It was beautiful in a harsh, alien way that made me understand why the Lakota had considered this land sacred. We made good time, reaching our planned campsite by mid-afternoon. Jake had chosen a spot near Paddock Creek, a seasonal waterway that carved a shallow channel through the clay and sandstone. A grove of cottonwoods provided some shelter from the constant wind that seemed to blow across the plains without pause. "Home, sweet home," Emma said, dropping her pack with obvious relief. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, and had been struggling with the weight despite our offers to redistribute gear. We worked efficiently to set up camp, falling into the rhythm we'd developed on previous trips. Tommy and I strung a tarp between 2 trees while Jake and Emma pitched their tent on the far side of the clearing. Sarah claimed a spot near the creek where the sound of running water would help her sleep. The first sign that something was wrong came when I tried to light the campfire. I'd built countless fires before. I knew how to arrange tinder and kindling, how to create a structure that would catch and sustain flame. But every match I struck seemed to gutter out before it could catch the dry grass and birch bark I'd gathered. The wind wasn't strong enough to explain it, just a gentle breeze that should have fed the flames, not killed them. "Here, let me try," Tommy said, pulling out his fancy waterproof lighter. But even the steady blue flame from his butane torch seemed to die as soon as it touched our carefully prepared tinder. Sarah crouched beside us, frowning. "That's weird. The wood looks dry enough." On the 4th attempt, the fire finally caught, but the flames burned with a strange blue-green tinge that made us all take a step back. Jake laughed nervously. Must be some mineral content in the wood, copper or something. The fire settled into normal yellow flames after a few minutes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The shadows cast by the firelight seemed deeper than they should be, and the darkness beyond our small circle felt absolute in a way that made my skin crawl. We cooked dinner, freeze-dried beef stew and instant mashed potatoes, and tried to recapture the easy camaraderie that had marked our previous adventures. But conversation felt forced, punctuated by long silences where we all found ourselves staring into the fire or peering into the darkness beyond. "Did anyone else notice that we haven't seen any wildlife?" Sarah asked around 9 o'clock. "No birds, no insects, nothing. That's not normal, right?" She was right. Now that she'd mentioned it, the absence of sound was oppressive. No owl calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush, not even the chirp of crickets. Just the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. "Maybe we're just too loud," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. Tommy pulled out his phone to check the weather forecast and frowned at the screen. "That's strange. I had full bars when we left the parking area, but now I'm not getting any signal at all." "We're in the middle of nowhere," Jake said. "Of course there's no signal." But Tommy shook his head. "No, look at this." He held up his phone and I could see the display in the firelight. Instead of the usual no service message, the screen showed a network name I'd never seen before: Hungry Hills. The signal strength indicator showed full bars, but every attempt to connect failed. We all checked our phones. Emma's showed the same mysterious network. Sarah's displayed 3 different phantom networks with names like Bone Creek and Starving Stone. My phone showed a network called Winter Coming, with 5 bars of signal strength and no data connection. "Someone's playing a prank," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "There must be a cell tower maintenance crew nearby." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Why would maintenance crews create fake network names? And why were all the names so ominous? Jake was studying his GPS unit, which had been working fine during our hike. Now the screen showed our location as a blank area with no topographical features, no trails, and no landmarks. The coordinates read N W, impossible numbers that placed us at the intersection of the equator and prime meridian somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. "The satellites must be having issues," he said, but his voice had taken on a strained quality. "Solar flares or something?" None of us wanted to admit what we were all thinking, that the technology failures felt deliberate, as if something was actively interfering with our ability to communicate with the outside world or determine our exact location. We decided to turn in early, but sleep proved elusive. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind and trying to identify the sounds that drifted through the darkness. At some point past midnight, I became convinced I could hear footsteps circling our campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause whenever I held my breath to listen more carefully. Around 2 a.m, Sarah screamed. We all scrambled out of our tents, Tommy clutching a flashlight with shaking hands. Sarah was sitting up in her sleeping bag, eyes wide with terror. "Someone was watching me," she gasped. "Right there, by the creek. A tall figure, just standing in the water." Tommy swept his light across the creek bank, but the beam revealed nothing except the gnarled roots of cottonwood trees and the gentle flow of dark water over rounded stones. "There's nothing there," Jake said, but he kept his voice low. "I know what I saw," Sarah insisted. "It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin. Too thin, and its eyes reflected the starlight like an animal's." Emma wrapped her arms around herself. "Maybe it was a deer. They can look pretty strange in the dark." But Sarah shook her head emphatically. "It was standing upright, on 2 legs, and when I looked at it," she shuddered. "It smiled. I could see its teeth." We spent the rest of the night huddled around the dying fire, taking turns keeping watch. Nothing else happened, but none of us got any real sleep. As dawn broke over the Badlands, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, we were all exhausted and on edge. "Maybe we should head back," Emma suggested as we shared a breakfast of instant oatmeal and bitter coffee. "This place feels wrong." But Jake was stubborn. "We've been planning this trip for months. We're not going to let some weird technical glitches and sleep deprivation scare us away." Tommy nodded agreement. "Sarah probably just saw a tree or something. The mind plays tricks when you're tired." I wanted to side with Emma, but the others outvoted us. We decided to spend one more night, then hike out the following morning. The second day started promisingly. The sun was warm, and a light breeze kept the insects away as we explored the area around our campsite. Jake led us up a game trail that wound between weathered rock formations, following what might have been an old buffalo path from centuries past. The landscape was stunning but alien. Wind and water had carved the soft rock into fantastic shapes, arches and pillars that looked almost architectural in their precision. The silence was still oppressive, but in daylight it felt more like peaceful solitude than menacing isolation. We stopped for lunch at the base of a red sandstone spire that rose nearly 100 feet above the surrounding terrain. Tommy climbed partway up the natural handholds, showing off for Emma, while Sarah took photos with her digital camera. "This is more like it," Jake said, settling back against a sun-warmed boulder. "Yesterday was just first-night jitters." But as afternoon wore on, the temperature began to drop with unnatural speed. By 4 o'clock, what had been a pleasant 70-degree day had become a bone-deep chill that made us dig into our packs for winter jackets. The sun was still shining, but its warmth seemed to stop inches from our skin. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, checking the thermometer on her pack. "It's reading 38 degrees. That's a 40-degree drop in 2 hours." More troubling was the way our breath had started to mist, despite the clear sky and lack of any weather system that might explain such a dramatic temperature change. Emma's lips were turning blue, and Tommy's hands shook as he tried to zip his jacket. We hurried back to camp as the premature cold settled over the landscape like a heavy blanket. The campfire seemed to struggle against the chill, its flames smaller and weaker than they should have been given the amount of fuel we'd added. "Look at the trees," Jake said, pointing to the cottonwoods around our site. The leaves, which had been golden yellow that morning, were now brown and brittle. As we watched, they began to fall despite the lack of any significant wind. Within minutes, the ground was carpeted with dead leaves that crunched underfoot like broken glass. "It's like winter came in a single afternoon," Emma whispered. "That's when we noticed that Tommy was missing. He'd been with us when we'd reached camp. I had a clear memory of him complaining about the cold and searching his pack for hand warmers, but now his bright red jacket was nowhere to be seen." "Tommy," Jake called. "Where'd you go, man?" No answer came from the gathering dusk. We spread out, searching the immediate area and calling his name. His pack was still in camp, his sleeping bag unrolled exactly as he'd left it, but Tommy himself had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. We spent an hour searching with flashlights, following the creek in both directions and checking every depression and outcropping where he might have taken shelter. Our voices echoed off the rock formations, but only silence answered back. "We need to hike out and get help," Sarah said. Her earlier terror had been replaced by practical concern. "Something's seriously wrong here." But Jake shook his head. "We can't abandon him. What if he's injured somewhere? Unable to call for help? What if whatever Sarah saw last night took him?" Emma asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us, too terrible to dismiss but too fantastic to fully accept. We were rational college students, not characters in a horror movie. People didn't just disappear in national parks without explanation, except that Tommy had. We built up the fire as high as we dared, creating a beacon that could be seen for miles across the flat terrain. The flames leaped and danced, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of the firelight. Every few minutes, one of us would call Tommy's name into the darkness, hoping for an answering shout. Around 11 o'clock, we got our answer. "Hey guys." Tommy's voice drifted out of the darkness beyond the firelight, casual and cheerful. "Sorry I wandered off. Got turned around looking for firewood." Relief flooded through me as his familiar silhouette emerged from the shadows. He was carrying an armload of dead branches, his red jacket bright in the firelight. "Jesus, Tommy, you scared us to death," Jake said. "Where have you been?" "Just exploring," Tommy replied, but something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. His face was pale in the firelight, paler than it should have been given the hours he'd supposedly spent outdoors. His eyes seemed darker, the pupils dilated despite the bright flames. And when he smiled at our obvious relief, I noticed that his teeth looked different, sharper, more pointed than I remembered. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked. "You've been gone for hours." Tommy tilted his head, considering the question with an odd, bird-like movement. "Hours?" It felt like minutes. Time moves differently out there in the dark. He dropped the firewood beside our blaze and sat down across from us. The branches he'd brought were bone-white and smooth, bleached clean of bark and moss. They burned with that same blue-green tinge we'd seen the night before, and the smoke had a sweet, cloying smell that made my stomach turn. "Where exactly did you go?" Emma asked. There was something in her voice, a wariness that matched my own growing unease. "There's a canyon about a mile north of here," Tommy said. "Beautiful place. There are caves in the walls and drawings on the rocks. Old drawings. The people who made them knew things. He stared into the fire as he spoke, his eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors. They knew about the hunger, about what lives in the deep places when winter comes early. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, but I could see the fear starting to creep into his expression. Tommy turned that strange, too wide smile on him. "Don't you feel it? The way the cold follows you now, the way it gets into your bones and stays there." As if summoned by his words, a wind rose from the north, carrying with it a chill that cut through our jackets like they were made of paper. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in seconds, and frost began to form on the ground around our feet. "Tommy," I said carefully, "you're scaring us. What happened to you out there?" For a moment, his expression flickered. The strange smile faltered, and I caught a glimpse of the friend I'd known for 2 years, confused, frightened, and fighting against something that had gotten its claws into his mind. "It found me in the dark," he whispered. "In the cave with the drawings. The hunger that lives in winter. It was so cold, Mike. So cold I thought I would die. And then—" The smile returned wider than before. "Then I stopped being cold. I stopped being a lot of things. That's when I noticed that despite the frigid air, Tommy wasn't shivering. His breath wasn't misting like ours. And the frost that was forming on the ground around us stopped in a perfect circle around where he sat, as if his presence was actively warming the earth." "We need to go," Sarah said suddenly. "Right now. We hike out in the dark." Tommy's head snapped toward her with inhuman speed. "Why would you want to leave? The real fun is just starting." He stood up, and I realized he was taller than he'd been that morning. Not just standing straighter, actually taller, his limbs stretched and elongated in proportions that hurt to look at directly. "The hunger is spreading," he said, his voice deepening into something that no human throat should have been able to produce. "It needs to feed before the true winter comes, and there's so much meat here, so much warmth to consume." Jake grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it like a weapon. "Stay back, Tommy. I don't know what's wrong with you, but—" Tommy laughed, a sound like breaking glass and wind through bone. "Wrong? Nothing's wrong. I'm better than I've ever been. Stronger. Faster. Hungrier." His skin was changing as we watched, taking on a grayish pallor that seemed to absorb the firelight. His fingernails had grown into curved talons, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. "The Wendigo knows you're here," he said. "It's been watching you since you arrived, waiting for the right moment, waiting for winter to come." Emma screamed as Tommy lunged toward her with impossible speed. Jake swung the burning branch, but Tommy caught it barehanded, the flames guttering out at his touch. His other hand closed around Emma's throat, lifting her off the ground as easily as picking up a doll. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was frozen in terror. The next I was sprinting into the darkness beyond our campsite with Sarah close behind me. Jake's shouts echoed through the night, followed by Emma's cut-off scream and then a terrible wet sound that I tried not to interpret. We ran blindly through the Badlands, stumbling over rocks and sliding down loose scree slopes. Behind us, something howled, a sound that started as Tommy's voice and became something inhuman, a cry of endless hunger that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a cluster of rock formations that rose like broken teeth from the prairie. "In there," she gasped. "We can hide." We squeezed between two massive sandstone pillars into a narrow space barely wide enough for our bodies. The rock walls rose 30 feet above us, creating a natural chimney that blocked out most of the starlight. We huddled together in the darkness, trying to control our breathing and listening for sounds of pursuit. The howling came again, closer now, and underneath it, we could hear voices, Jake's voice calling for help, and Emma's laughter. High and sweet and completely wrong. They were both out there in the darkness, and they were both calling our names. "Don't listen," Sarah whispered. "It's not them anymore." But Jake's voice was so convincing, so desperate. "Mike, Sarah, where are you?" Emma's hurt, but she's alive. We need to get her to a hospital." Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that what we'd seen had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and cold. But I remembered the inhuman length of Tommy's arms, the way his touch had extinguished fire, and the sound Emma had made when those claws closed around her throat. We waited in our rocky hiding place as the voices circled our position. Sometimes it was Jake pleading for help. Sometimes it was Emma, singing old camp songs in a voice like breaking crystal. And sometimes it was Tommy, promising that the hunger would make everything better, that the cold would take away all our pain. The worst part was how reasonable they sounded. How human. If I hadn't seen Tommy's transformation with my own eyes, I might have believed that our friends were simply lost and scared, calling for us in the darkness. Around 3 a.m, the voices stopped. We waited another hour before Sarah whispered, "Do you think they're gone?" I was about to answer when something scraped against the rock above us. Pebbles rained down into our hiding place, and I looked up to see a silhouette against the stars, something that might have been human once, but was now stretched and distorted like a figure from a nightmare. "Found you," it said in Emma's voice. The thing that had been Emma dropped into our narrow sanctuary with cat-like grace. In the starlight, I could see that her transformation was further along than Tommy's had been. Her skin was the color of old bone, her fingers ended in curved talons, and her eyes were completely black. When she smiled, her teeth were like broken glass. "The Wendigo is so pleased," she said. "2 more warm hearts to consume, 2 more souls to add to the hunger." Sarah pressed against me, trembling. "Emma, please, it's us, your friends." Emma tilted her head, considering. Emma was weak, cold and afraid and dying slowly inside, but the hunger made her strong, made her perfect. She reached toward us with those terrible claws, but I grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at her face. It struck her cheek with a wet sound, and black ichor spilled from the wound. Emma hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a radiator, and lunged forward. I shoved Sarah toward the narrow opening between the rocks and followed, my jacket tearing on the rough stone. We emerged into the open prairie just as dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the Badlands in shades of blood and gold. Behind us, Emma's inhuman shriek echoed from the rock chimney. She was too large now to follow us through the gap, her body too transformed to fit through the space that had sheltered us. We ran toward the sunrise, following what I hoped was the general direction of the trailhead. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, and my lungs burned in the frigid air. The temperature was still dropping despite the approaching dawn, and our breath came in great white puffs that hung in the air like smoke. "There," Sarah gasped, pointing toward a line of cottonwoods that marked the course of a creek. "If we follow the water, it should lead us back to the main trail." But as we approached the trees, figures emerged from their shadows. Jake and Tommy standing side by side at the water's edge. They looked almost normal in the morning light, except for their too pale skin and the predatory way they watched our approach. "Why are you running from us?" Jake asked. His voice was hurt, confused. "We're your friends." "We want to help you," Tommy added. "The hunger doesn't have to hurt. It can be beautiful, peaceful." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't listen. They're not our friends anymore." But Jake's expression was so earnest, so familiar. "Of course we're your friends. What happened last night was just a misunderstanding. We were all scared, acting crazy, but everything's fine now." He held up his hands, showing us that they were normal human hands with normal human fingers. No claws, no elongated proportions. "See? I'm still me." For a moment, I almost believed him. The rational part of my mind wanted to accept his explanation, to believe that the horrors of the night had been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and cold. Then I noticed that neither Jake nor Tommy cast shadows in the morning sunlight. "Run," I whispered to Sarah. We bolted toward the creek, but they were faster than any human could be. Tommy reached us first, his friendly mask slipping as his features began to stretch and distort. His reaching hands sprouted claws that raked across my back, shredding my jacket and drawing blood. I spun and drove my elbow into his solar plexus. The impact felt like hitting a tree trunk, but it staggered him long enough for me to grab Sarah's hand and vault across the narrow creek. Jake was waiting for us on the other side. He caught Sarah around the waist, lifting her off the ground as she screamed and clawed at his arms. "The Wendigo is hungry," he said in a voice like grinding stone. "And it's been winter for so long." I picked up a fallen cottonwood branch thick as a baseball bat and swung it at Jake's head with all my strength. The wood splintered on impact, and Jake released Sarah with a howl of rage. Black ichor poured from a gash across his forehead, steaming in the cold air. "You can't fight the hunger forever," he snarled. "It's in you now. The cold, the need. You'll feed eventually, or you'll freeze to death trying to resist." He was right about the cold. Despite our desperate flight, despite the adrenaline pumping through my system, I was colder than I'd ever been in my life. The chill was seeping into my bones, making my movements sluggish and my thoughts fuzzy. Sarah was shivering uncontrollably, her lips blue and her face pale. "I can't feel my fingers," she whispered. Tommy had crossed the creek behind us, and Emma's inhuman shriek echoed from somewhere in the distance. They were hurting us, driving us away from any possible escape route and deeper into the wilderness where no one would ever find our bodies. That's when I remembered the park ranger's warning from our permit briefing. "If you get in trouble out there," he'd said, "head for high ground and build a signal fire. The smoke can be seen for miles." The nearest high ground was a red sandstone butte about half a mile to the south. It rose maybe 200 feet above the surrounding terrain, and its flat top would be visible from the main road through the park. "This way," I told Sarah, pulling her toward the distant rock formation. We ran as fast as our exhausted bodies would allow, but the cold was slowing us down. Our pursuers maintained their distance, following at an easy lope that suggested they were enjoying the hunt. "They're playing with us," Sarah gasped as we began climbing the steep game trail that wound up the butte's eastern face. She was right. The creatures that had been our friends could have caught us at any time. They were faster, stronger, and apparently immune to the supernatural cold that was steadily sapping our strength. But they seemed content to let us exhaust ourselves, to let the Wendigo's winter freeze us to the bone before moving in for the kill. The climb up the butte was a nightmare of the loose rock and sheer drops. My hands were so numb I could barely grip the stone, and Sarah was weaving with exhaustion. But we kept climbing, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. Halfway up, Tommy's voice drifted up from below. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. The cold will kill you long before you reach the top. Why not just let us help you?" I looked back and saw all three of them at the base of the butte, staring up at us with those black, hungry eyes. They weren't even breathing hard. "The Wendigo offers a gift," Emma called. "Freedom from cold, from hunger, from fear. All you have to do is stop fighting." "Ignore them," I told Sarah. "Keep climbing." But the cold was becoming overwhelming. Each breath was like swallowing ice, and my heart was struggling to pump blood through veins that felt like they were filled with slush. Sarah's movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated, and I knew we were both showing signs of severe hypothermia. We reached the top of the butte just as the sun climbed above the horizon. The view was spectacular, mile after mile of eroded landscape stretching to the distant black hills. Somewhere out there was the main road, civilization, and help. But first we needed to signal for rescue. I still had a lighter in my pocket, and the top of the butte was littered with dry grass and scattered deadfall from stunted juniper trees. Working with numb fingers, I managed to build a small fire and feed it with everything burnable I could find. The flames were pitifully small at first, but they grew steadily as I added fuel. Soon, we had a respectable blaze that sent a thin column of smoke rising into the morning sky. "Will anyone see it?" Sarah asked. She was sitting close to the fire, holding her hands so near the flames I was afraid she'd burn herself. Park rangers patrol the main roads, I said. If anyone's out there, they'll see the smoke. But even as I spoke, I could feel the unnatural cold creeping closer. The temperature around our fire was dropping despite the growing flames, and frost was forming on the ground in an expanding circle. They were coming up the butte. I could hear them now, the scrape of claws on stone and the whisper of inhuman voices promising peace and warmth and an end to our suffering. They weren't hurrying. There was nowhere left for us to run. "Mike," Sarah's voice was small and distant. "I can't feel the fire anymore." She was right. The flames were burning as high as ever, but their heat seemed to stop inches from our bodies. The Wendigo's winter was consuming everything, turning our world into a frozen wasteland where warmth couldn't exist. Tommy's head appeared over the edge of the butte, followed by his impossibly elongated body. Jake and Emma flanked him, their transformations now complete. They looked like creatures from a prehistoric nightmare, gaunt, pale things with 2 long limbs and mouths full of needle teeth. "Last chance," Jake said in a voice like grinding ice. "Join us willingly, and the change will be gentle. Fight, and you'll freeze slowly while we watch." I stood up, putting myself between the Wendigo spawn and Sarah. My lighter was still in my hand, and I flicked it open. The small blue flame seemed pathetically inadequate against the encroaching cold. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll burn this whole place down before I let you touch her." Tommy laughed, the sound echoing off the rock walls. "Fire can't hurt us anymore. We are winter now. We are the hunger that devours heat and light and life." But something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain, and I remembered how the flames had guttered when he'd grabbed the burning branch back at camp. The Wendigo's servants might be immune to normal cold, but fire still had power over them. I grabbed a burning branch from our signal fire and advanced on Tommy. He took a step back, his confidence wavering. "Stay away from us," I said, swinging the makeshift torch in wide arcs. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Emma hissed and circled to my left. But I kept the flames between us. The fire seemed to have its own life now, burning brighter and hotter than it should have given the fuel I'd fed it. That's when I heard the helicopter. The sound was faint at first, barely audible over the wind and the crackling of flames, but it grew steadily louder, the distinctive whoop 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 of rotor blades cutting through air. "Someone saw the smoke," Sarah whispered. The Wendigo spawn heard it too. Their heads snapped toward the sky in unison, and for the first time since the hunt began, they looked uncertain. "Too late," Jake snarled. "We'll take you both before they arrive." But as he lunged forward, I thrust the burning branch directly into his chest. The impact sent him tumbling backward with a shriek that shattered the morning air. Where the flames had touched him, his pale skin was blackened and peeling. The helicopter was closer now, close enough that I could see the Park Service markings on its side. It circled the butte once, the pilot obviously noting our signal fire and the figures on the summit. Tommy and Emma were backing away from our position, their forms already beginning to blur and fade in the growing daylight. Whatever power the Wendigo held over them was weaker in direct sunlight, and the approaching rescue had broken the spell of isolation that had trapped us in their supernatural winter. "This isn't over," Emma said, her voice fading like an echo. "The hunger never dies. It just waits." Then they were gone, vanishing like smoke in the wind. The temperature began to rise immediately, and I could feel the fire's warmth against my face for the first time in hours. The helicopter touched down on the flat summit, and 2 park rangers jumped out. They found us huddled by our signal fire, hypothermic and in shock, babbling about Wendigos and supernatural cold. The official report listed our friends as missing persons, presumed dead from exposure. Search teams found no trace of Jake, Emma, or Tommy, despite weeks of effort. The investigators concluded that they had become separated from our group during the night and succumbed to a freak cold snap that had dropped temperatures to near-record lows. But I know the truth. They're still out there in the Badlands, waiting for winter to come again, waiting for new victims to join the endless hunger. Sarah and I never spoke about what really happened that night. We both transferred to different schools after graduation, and I've made sure to stay far away from any place where the old stories still have power. But sometimes, on the coldest nights of winter, I wake up from dreams of pale figures with black eyes and needled teeth, and I know that somewhere in the darkness the Wendigo is still hunting. The hunger never dies. It just waits. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the Little Missouri National Grassland, North Dakota, 3 miles west of the burning coal vein, where the earth still smolders from a fire that's been burning underground for over a century. We were supposed to be celebrating Jennifer's promotion at the marketing firm where we all worked. 4 friends from college, finally making good money, finally able to afford the kind of adventure we'd always talked about but never had the cash for. The plan was simple: 3 days of backcountry camping in one of the most remote sections of North Dakota's wilderness. No cell towers, no roads, just us and the endless grassland that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean frozen in time. I should have known something was wrong when we couldn't get our GPS to lock onto our location properly at the trailhead. The device kept showing us as being in 3 different places simultaneously, the blue dot jumping erratically across the screen like a panicked animal. Robert Johnson, our self-appointed navigator and the most outdoorsy of our group, laughed it off. "Technology," he said, shaking his head as he tucked the GPS into his pack. "This is why I always bring paper maps." Sarah Rodriguez, petite but fierce, was already shouldering her pack with the kind of efficiency that made her such a good project manager. "Maybe it's the burning coal vein," she suggested. "All that underground fire probably messes with electronics." Jennifer Davis, the reason for our celebration, was checking her phone one last time before we headed into the dead zone. "No signal anyway," she said, powering it down. "Guess we're really doing this off-grid thing." The first day was perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you feel foolish for spending your life indoors, staring at computer screens and breathing recycled air. The grassland rolled away from us in gentle waves, dotted with islands of cottonwood and scattered limestone outcroppings that looked like ancient teeth jutting from the earth. The sky was so vast and blue it made you dizzy to look at it too long. We made good time, following what Robert assured us was a game trail that would lead us to a secluded camping spot near Wanigan Creek. The creek was seasonal, he explained, but there should still be pools of water this time of year. We'd checked the weather religiously. 3 days of clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The silence, for one thing. In 4 hours of hiking, we hadn't seen a single bird. No insects buzzing around our heads, no small mammals scurrying through the grass. Just an oppressive, cathedral-like quiet that seemed to swallow even our voices. "Where is everything?" I asked during our second water break. Jennifer looked around and I saw her expression shift slightly. "Now that you mention it, it is pretty dead out here." Robert was studying his map, his brow furrowed. "We should have hit the creek by now," he muttered. "According to this, we should have crossed it 20 minutes ago." "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Sarah suggested, but even she sounded uncertain. "I don't think so." Robert's voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. "I've been following this trail exactly. We should be right here." He stabbed at a point on the map with his finger. That's when we noticed the smell. Faint at first, like something sweet that had gone bad in the sun. Death, but not the clean death of roadkill baking on asphalt. This was older, deeper, organic decay with an undertone of something else, something that made my hindbrain scream warnings I didn't understand. We found our campsite just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the grassland in shades of gold and red that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous. The creek was there, exactly where Robert's map said it would be, but it was completely dry except for a few stagnant pools that looked more like open wounds in the earth than water sources. "Well, this sucks," Sarah said, kicking at the cracked mud that lined the creek bed. "Good thing we brought extra water." We made camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the dry creek, following all the backcountry protocols Robert had drilled into us during our planning sessions. Food stored properly, no scented items in the tent, campfire built in a ring of stones well away from any vegetation. Everything by the book. But as darkness fell, I began to understand why our ancestors feared the night. The silence that had unsettled me during the day became something alive and malevolent after sunset. It pressed against us like a physical thing, broken only by the crack and pop of our campfire and our own nervous chatter. "You know what's weird?" Jennifer said, staring into the flames. "I keep feeling like we're being watched." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Don't say that." "No, seriously, look around. Look at the edge of the firelight." We all turned to peer into the darkness beyond our small circle of safety, and I felt my blood freeze. There, just at the very edge of where the firelight faded into black, shapes seemed to shift and move. Nothing definite, nothing you could point to and say, "there," but the unmistakable sense of eyes watching us from the void. "It's just our imaginations," Robert said, but his voice was tight. "Human brains are hardwired to see threats in darkness. Pareidolia. It's completely normal." Sarah stood up suddenly, her face pale. "Does anyone else hear that?" We listened. At first, there was only the fire and the sound of our own breathing. Then, so faint it might have been imagination, came a sound like wind through dry leaves. Except there was no wind, and we were surrounded by grass, not trees. The sound came again, closer this time. Not wind through leaves. Whispering. Too distant to make out words, but definitely human voices having a conversation just beyond our hearing. "Okay, that's not normal," I said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight from my pack. "Don't," Robert said sharply. "Don't shine a light out there." "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment, his face strange in the firelight. "I don't know. It just feels wrong." We spent the night in shifts, keeping the fire burning bright and high. None of us admitted to being scared, but nobody suggested we all sleep at the same time either. During my watch, sometime around 3 a.m., I saw them. Figures moving in the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky. Tall, impossibly thin, walking with a strange loping gait that didn't look quite human. They circled our camp at a distance, never coming close enough for me to get a clear look, but close enough for me to count them. 7 figures moving in single file around and around our small island of light. I should have woken the others. Should have pointed them out, confirmed that I wasn't losing my mind. But some deep, primal instinct told me that drawing attention to the watchers would be the worst possible thing I could do. So I sat there, frozen with terror, watching the figures patrol the darkness until dawn finally broke and they melted away like smoke. The next morning, none of us talked about the night. We broke camp efficiently, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever we'd experienced. But as we prepared to leave, Robert made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. "These aren't our footprints," he said, crouched beside the dry creek bed where the morning light revealed clear impressions in the mud. We gathered around to look. The prints were human-shaped, but wrong. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips where toes should be. And they were everywhere, dozens of them, circling the spot where we'd camped. "Some kind of animal," Jennifer said, but her voice was shaky. Maybe wolves? With deformed paws?" "Wolves don't walk on 2 legs," Sarah whispered. Robert was studying the tracks with the methodical intensity he brought to everything. "These were made during the night," he said finally, "after the mud dried from yesterday's heat, but before the dew this morning. And look at this." He pointed to a set of prints that came right up to the edge of our campsite, stopping just outside the ring of stones we'd built around our fire. Whatever had made them had stood there for some time. The impressions were deep, as if something had been watching us while we slept. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." Nobody argued. We hiked in silence for the first hour, each of us lost in our own thoughts and fears. The landscape seemed different in daylight, more hostile somehow. The rolling grassland that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt like it was hiding things. Every shadow cast by the scattered trees looked like a place where something could be crouching, waiting. It was Sarah who noticed that we were being followed. "Don't look back," she said quietly as we crested a low hill, "but there's something behind us, about a quarter mile." I felt my heart start hammering in my chest. What kind of something? I can't tell. It's keeping its distance, but it's definitely following us. Every time we stop, it stops. When we move, it moves. Robert consulted his map, his hands shaking slightly. "We're about 6 miles from the trailhead," he said. "If we push hard, we can make it by early afternoon." But as the morning wore on, it became clear that something was very wrong with our navigation. The landmarks Robert had been using to guide us seemed to have shifted, or disappeared entirely. Hills that should have been to our east were now to our south. The sun itself seemed to be moving in the wrong direction, casting shadows that made no sense. "This is impossible," Robert muttered, turning the map around and around as if a different orientation might make the terrain match what we were seeing. "We should be able to see Highway 85 from here. There should be a road." "Maybe we got turned around," Jennifer suggested, but her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "I've been navigating by compass," Robert said. "We've been heading north-northeast the whole time, exactly like we planned. But none of this matches the map." That's when we realized we were lost. Not just a little off course, but genuinely completely lost in a way that shouldn't have been possible in the age of GPS and detailed topographic maps. It was as if the landscape itself had rearranged while we weren't looking, becoming a maze designed to trap us. The thing following us was getting closer. Sarah had been keeping track of it all morning, and she reported that it was now less than 100 yards behind us, though still staying out of sight behind the rolling hills. "We need to find water," I said, checking my supply, "and shelter. If we're going to be out here another night—" "We're not going to be out here another night," Robert said firmly. "I'm going to figure this out." But as afternoon faded toward evening, we had to face the reality that we were going to have to make camp again. We found a defensible position on top of a low hill, with good sight lines in all directions. No dry creek beds this time, no convenient hiding places for whatever was stalking us. As we set up our second camp, Robert volunteered to gather firewood from a small grove of cottonwoods about 100 yards away. "There's good dead wood down there," he said, "enough to keep a fire going all night." "Don't go alone," Sarah said immediately. "I'll be fine. I can see the camp from there, and you can see me. If anything happens, just yell." He walked down the hill toward the trees, moving with the confident stride that had made him the natural leader of our group. We watched him disappear into the grove, saw the trees shake as he moved among them gathering wood. Then the shaking stopped. We waited. 5 minutes became 10, then 15. The grove was completely still, no sign of movement. "Robert," Jennifer called. "You okay down there?" No answer. "Robert." Still nothing. The silence stretched out, heavy and ominous. "I'm going down there," I said, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Wait, look." A figure emerged from the trees, walking up the hill toward us with an armload of firewood. Robert, looking exactly like himself except for something indefinable that made my skin crawl. His movements were too fluid, too graceful, his smile too wide. "Sorry," he called out as he approached. "Found some great stuff down there, really dry, should burn perfect." But his voice was wrong. The words were right, the tone was right, but there was something hollow about it, like an echo of Robert's voice rather than the voice itself. "You were gone for 20 minutes, Jennifer said, and I heard the suspicion in her tone. We were worried. 20 minutes? Robert looked genuinely surprised. Felt like 5 to me. Time flies when you're having fun, I guess. He began building the fire with mechanical precision, stacking the wood in a perfect pyramid that would burn long and hot. But as he worked, I noticed things that made my blood run cold. Robert was left-handed. I'd seen him write 1,000 times during college, But this Robert was using his right hand to arrange the kindling. When Sarah made a joke about our situation, he laughed, but it was a beat too late, as if he had to think about the appropriate response. And his eyes. Robert had brown eyes, warm and friendly. These eyes were the right color, but they were flat, empty, like looking into the eyes of a mannequin. "Robert," I said carefully, "what's the name of that bar we used to go to in college? The one where you met that girl from your statistics class?" He looked at me blankly for a moment, and I saw something flicker behind those dead eyes. Confusion, maybe fear. "I don't remember," he said finally. "College was a long time ago." But it wasn't. We'd graduated 18 months ago, and Robert had perfect recall for everything that had ever happened to him. It was one of his most annoying traits. The way he could remember every detail of every conversation, every shared experience. Jennifer and Sarah had noticed it too. I could see it in their faces, the growing horror as they realized that whatever was wearing Robert's face wasn't Robert at all. The thing that looked like our friend finished building the fire and sat back on its heels, smiling that too wide smile. "Should keep us warm all night," it said. "Nothing like a good fire to keep the scary things away." But the fire it had built was wrong. The flames burned blue at the edges, throwing strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. And the smoke, instead of rising straight up into the still air, it coiled and writhed like something alive. "Where's Robert?" Sarah asked quietly. "What did you do with him?" The thing's smile never wavered. "I am Robert. Don't you recognize me?" "Prove it," I said. "Tell us something only Robert would know." It tilted its head, considering. When it spoke, it was Robert's voice, but the words came out in a monotone, like someone reading from a script. "We went to State University together. Jennifer works in marketing. Sarah is a project manager. Michael writes code. We came here to camp." Basic facts. Things it could have learned by listening to our conversations. But nothing personal, nothing that required actual memory or emotion. "That's not good enough," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Tell us about the time you got food poisoning from the dining hall. Tell us about your sister's wedding. Tell us about the scar on your knee from when you fell off your bike." The thing's smile finally faded. When it spoke again, its voice was different. Still Robert's vocal cords, but with something else using them. "He's still here," it said, tapping its temple with one finger. "Locked away in the dark, screaming. Would you like to hear him scream?" And then it opened its mouth impossibly wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to open. And Robert's voice came pouring out in a shriek of pure agony that went on until I thought my eardrums would burst. We ran. There was no plan, no coordination. We just grabbed what we could and fled into the darkness, leaving the fire and most of our supplies behind. Behind us, the thing that wore Robert's face laughed with a sound like breaking glass. We stumbled through the night, driven by pure terror. The grassland became a maze of shadows and phantom shapes, every sound magnified into something threatening. Several times we thought we'd lost each other, calling out in whispers and regrouping by touch rather than sight. As dawn approached, we found ourselves in a small depression surrounded by limestone outcroppings. Exhausted, scared, and completely lost, we huddled together and tried to make sense of what had happened. "That wasn't Robert," Sarah said, stating the obvious. "Then where is he?" Jennifer asked. "Where's the real Robert?" I thought about the thing's words, about Robert being locked away in the dark, screaming. The image made me sick. "We have to assume he's dead," I said, though the words felt like poison in my mouth. "Whatever that thing is, it's using his body. He's gone." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. There had been something in those empty eyes, a flicker of recognition when I'd asked about the bar. Maybe Robert was still in there somewhere, trapped inside his own skull while something else controlled his body. As the sun rose, we tried to get our bearings. The landscape around us was completely unfamiliar, jagged rock formations that looked like they belonged in Arizona rather than North Dakota. twisted trees that seemed to grow in impossible directions, and in the distance, what looked like smoke rising from the ground itself. "The burning coal vein," Jennifer said, pointing toward the smoke. "That has to be it. If we can find that, we can navigate back to the road." But as we walked toward the smoke, the landscape continued to shift around us. Hills that had been to our left would suddenly be on our right. Valleys we'd crossed would appear again ahead of us, forcing us to cross them a second time. It was as if we were walking through a living maze, one that rearranged itself to keep us trapped. And always, just at the edge of perception, we could sense something following us. Not the Robert thing. This was different. Multiple presences, keeping pace with us but staying hidden. Whenever one of us would turn to look back, there would be nothing there. But the feeling of being watched never went away. On the second day of our flight, Sarah collapsed. We'd been walking for hours without rest, driven by the fear that stopping would mean death. But Sarah had been pushing herself too hard, and her body finally gave out. She went down hard, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "I can't," she gasped as we tried to help her up. "I can't go any further." Jennifer knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's dehydrated," she said, "and probably hypoglycemic. She needs rest, and she needs food." But we had no food. We'd left everything behind when we fled from the Robert thing. No supplies, no water, no way to start a fire even if we'd dared to make one. "Leave me," Sarah whispered. "You two keep going. Find help." "Like hell," I said. "We're not leaving anyone behind." But as we argued about what to do, the decision was taken out of our hands. Sarah started convulsing, her back arching off the ground as foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. Jennifer grabbed her shoulders, trying to keep her from biting her tongue, but Sarah's strength was inhuman. "This isn't a seizure," Jennifer said, fear making her voice high and tight. "This is something else." Sarah's convulsions stopped as suddenly as they'd started. She lay still for a moment, then sat up with the same fluid grace we'd seen in the Robert thing. When she opened her eyes, they were just as empty, just as wrong. "Hello," she said in Sarah's voice, but with that same hollow quality. "Miss me?" I grabbed Jennifer's hand and we ran again, leaving our friend behind to whatever had taken her. As we fled, I could hear Sarah laughing, the sound echoing off the rocks with an quality that made my bones ache. Now, there were only two of us left. We found temporary shelter in a narrow canyon between two limestone cliffs. It was a dead end, which meant nothing could sneak up behind us, but it also meant we were trapped if something found us. Jennifer was in shock, staring straight ahead and occasionally muttering fragments of prayers she'd learned as a child. "They're picking us off one by one," I said, more to myself than to her. "Whatever's out here, it's playing with us." "Why?" Jennifer asked. "What does it want?" I thought about the tracks around our first campsite, about the figures I'd seen circling us in the darkness. "I think we're in its territory, and I think it's hungry." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I didn't want to consider. But the pieces were falling into place. The absence of wildlife, the way the landscape seemed to shift around us, the way our friends had been taken and replaced by hollow approximations. We were being hunted by something that didn't just kill its prey, it consumed them, body and soul, leaving behind puppets that could walk and talk but had no real life behind the eyes. Night fell again, and with it came the sounds. Footsteps circling our hiding place, accompanied by familiar voices calling our names. Robert's voice, asking us to come out so we could talk. Sarah's voice, promising she was feeling better and just wanted to go home. But underneath the words, there was something else. A wet, tearing sound like meat being pulled apart, and a smell that made my stomach turn. The same sweet, sick odor of decay we'd noticed on our first day, but stronger now. Much stronger. "Michael," Jennifer whispered. "I can see them." I looked toward the mouth of the canyon and felt my sanity slip another notch. The Robert thing and the Sarah thing were standing at the entrance, but they weren't quite right. Their faces seemed to be melting slightly, features sliding around like wax in heat, and their bodies. Something was wrong with their proportions. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that made no sense. "We know you're in there," the Robert thing called, its voice now obviously artificial, like a recording played through a broken speaker. "Why don't you come out? We have so much to show you." The Sarah thing giggled, a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "It doesn't hurt," it said. "Well, not for very long. And then you get to be part of something so much bigger than yourself." They started walking toward us, their movements becoming more and more inhuman with each step. Their arms swung too loose like marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Their faces continued to shift and melt, revealing glimpses of something underneath that made my eyes water to look at directly. "There's another way out," Jennifer said suddenly, grabbing my arm. "Look." At the back of the canyon, hidden behind a fallen boulder, was a crack in the rock wall just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. We scrambled toward it as the things that had been our friends continued their approach, their voices now mixing together in a harmonic hum that vibrated in my chest cavity. The crack led to a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. We crawled through it by feel, guided only by a faint current of air that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. Behind us, we could hear the things trying to follow, but their stolen bodies were too large and clumsy to fit through the passage. The tunnel opened into a large underground chamber lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And there, scattered across the cavern floor, we found the truth. Bones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in neat piles according to type. Skulls here, ribs there, femurs sorted by size. Some of them were old, yellowed with age. Others were fresh, still glistening with traces of marrow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the corner where the incomplete skeletons lay. Bodies that had been partially consumed, leaving behind horrific combinations of bone and desiccated flesh. And among them, still wearing his familiar hiking boots, was Robert, the real Robert, what was left of him. Jennifer made a sound like a wounded animal and collapsed to her knees. I forced myself to look closer, to confirm what I already knew. Most of Robert's flesh was gone, consumed by something with teeth like razors. But his face was intact, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. And his eyes were still moving. "Help," he whispered, the word barely audible through lips that were mostly gone. "Please, help me." He was still alive, after everything that had been done to him, after being used as a puppet by whatever lived in this place. He was still conscious and aware, still feeling every moment of his slow consumption. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to wake up from this nightmare and find myself back in my apartment, safe and sane and whole. But Jennifer was looking at me with an expression that said she was counting on me to get us out of this. And Robert, what was left of Robert, was begging for help with eyes that held too much pain for any human being to endure. I looked around the cavern, trying to find something I could use as a weapon. That's when I noticed the drawings on the walls. Crude pictographs that seemed to tell a story, figures dancing around a fire, tall, thin shapes watching from the darkness. And in the center of it all, something massive and hungry with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. The local tribes had known about this thing. They'd tried to contain it, to appease it with offerings. But something had gone wrong, and it had been freed to hunt in the grasslands above. A sound from the tunnel behind us made me turn. The things wearing our friends' faces had found another way in. I could hear them moving through the rock, their stolen bodies making wet sliding sounds as they navigated passages too small for normal human anatomy. "We have to go," I whispered to Jennifer. "Now." But she was staring at something else, her face white with horror. Following her gaze, I saw movement in the shadows at the far end of the cavern. Something huge and pale was stirring, unfolding itself from a crevice in the rock wall. The Wendigo. I'd heard the stories. Of course, Native American legends about cannibalistic creatures that haunted the northern wilderness. But I'd always assumed they were just stories, metaphors for the dangers of isolation and starvation. I'd been wrong. The thing that emerged from the shadows was 15 feet tall and covered in matted white fur that might once have been human hair. Its limbs were too long, too thin, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. But it was the face that nearly broke my mind. Human features stretched and distorted beyond recognition, with a mouth full of yellowed fangs and eyes that burned with an intelligence both ancient and utterly malevolent. It looked at us with those burning eyes and smiled, revealing rows of teeth stained with old blood. "Fresh meat," it said in a voice like grinding stone, "and such tender meat. You've led me a fine chase, little ones." Jennifer was frozen with terror, unable to move or speak. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward what looked like another tunnel entrance on the opposite side of the cavern. Behind us, the Wendigo laughed, a sound like an avalanche. "Run," it said, amused by our desperation. "I do so enjoy the chase." We stumbled through a maze of underground passages, guided by panic and desperate hope. The tunnels were a network carved by water over millennia, connecting chambers and caverns throughout the limestone bedrock. Behind us, we could hear the Wendigo following at a leisurely pace, confident that we had nowhere to go. But as we ran, I began to notice something. The phosphorescent glow that lit the tunnels was stronger in some directions than others. And wherever it was strongest, I could feel a slight breeze carrying the scent of fresh air. We were following an underground stream that had to surface somewhere. The tunnel began to slope upward, and the sound of moving water grew louder. We were climbing toward the surface, toward daylight and the possibility of escape. Behind us, the Wendigo's laughter echoed through the stone, but it seemed more distant now. We emerged from a crack in a limestone cliff into blinding sunlight. We were on the shore of a small lake, surrounded by the kind of rolling grassland we'd been lost in for what felt like weeks. But this landscape looked normal, familiar. No twisted trees, no impossible geography. Just North Dakota wilderness under a blue sky. "The road," Jennifer gasped, pointing toward a line of telephone poles visible in the distance. "That has to be Highway 85. We ran across the grassland, no longer caring about stealth or caution. All that mattered was reaching that road, reaching civilization and safety. The grass seemed to part before us, as if the land itself wanted us to escape. We reached the highway just as a state trooper was driving by on patrol. The officer took one look at us, two hikers who'd been lost in the wilderness for 3 days, dehydrated and terrified, and called for medical assistance immediately. At the hospital in Williston, we told them about our friends. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to the area where we'd been camping, but they found nothing. No trace of Robert or Sarah, no evidence of our campsites, no sign that anyone had ever been in that section of the grassland. The GPS coordinates we gave them led to a farming road that had been in continuous use for decades. The official report listed Robert Johnson and Sarah Rodriguez as missing persons, presumed dead from exposure or misadventure in the wilderness. Jennifer and I never spoke publicly about what we'd really seen out there. Who would believe us? But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing from the north, I can still hear Robert's voice calling my name. And in my dreams, I see Sarah's empty eyes staring at me from the darkness, promising that it doesn't hurt for very long. The doctors said we were lucky to survive. They said that exposure and dehydration can cause hallucinations, that trauma can make people remember things that never really happened. They gave us medication for anxiety and recommended therapy to help us process the loss of our friends. I let them believe their rational explanations. It's easier that way, safer for everyone involved. But I know what I saw in that cavern beneath the grassland. I know what's still down there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the marked trails. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the countryside at night, I catch glimpses of tall, thin figures moving through the fields at the edge of my headlight beams. They're always too far away to see clearly, too quick to focus on, but I know they're there, watching and waiting. The Wendigo is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it's always hungry. 6 months after our rescue, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of bark with crude symbols carved into it, the same symbols I'd seen on the cavern walls. And wrapped inside the bark was a single finger bone, gnawed clean but still bearing traces of familiar nail polish. Sarah's favorite shade of red. I burned the package in my fireplace and moved to a city on the East Coast, as far from North Dakota as I could get. But distance doesn't matter to some things. Every few weeks I find small offerings left on my doorstep. Bones, always bones, picked clean and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Wendigo is telling me that it remembers, that it knows where I live, where I work, where I sleep, that when it gets tired of playing with its current victims, it will come for me. And someday, when I'm old and weak and can't run anymore, it will. But until then, I endure, I survive, and I warn others to stay away from the Little Missouri National Grassland, especially the areas near the burning coal vein where the earth itself smolders with ancient fire. Because some hungers can never be satisfied, and some things are better left undisturbed in the darkness where they belong. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in North Dakota's Theodore Roosevelt National Park, in the remote Badlands near Wind Canyon, during the 3rd week of October 2023. Robert Johnson and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd been cubicle slaves at the same insurance firm in Fargo for 3 years, and the suffocating fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets had been eating away at our souls like acid. Rob was the kind of guy who still collected vintage horror movies and could quote The Thing word for word. I was more practical, always the one who remembered to pack extra batteries and first aid supplies. We made a good team. The Ma-Da-Hay Trail stretches for 144 miles through some of the most isolated terrain in North Dakota, and we'd chosen a particularly remote section near the Little Missouri River. Our plan was simple: 3 days of hiking, 2 nights camping under stars unpolluted by city lights, and a chance to remember what silence actually sounded like. The first sign something was wrong should have been our phones. Both died simultaneously as we passed mile marker 47, even though they'd shown full charge just minutes before. The GPS on my Garmin watch started displaying coordinates that placed us somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Rob laughed it off, pulling out the paper topographical map we'd bought as backup. "Technology, man," he said, spreading the map on a flat boulder. "Give me good old-fashioned paper any day." But when we unfolded the map, the ink was faded in spots, as if decades had passed overnight. The marked trail we'd been following simply wasn't there anymore. According to the map, we were standing in the middle of virgin wilderness that had never been touched by human feet. "Must be a misprint," I muttered, but my voice sounded thin in the vast emptiness surrounding us. The October wind carried a bitter cold that seemed to cut right through our jackets, and the sky had taken on a sickly yellow tinge that made my skin crawl. We pressed on, following what looked like game trails through the labyrinthine ravines and jagged rock formations. The Badlands stretched endlessly in every direction, a moonscape of eroded clay and sandstone that looked like the bones of some massive, ancient beast. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be, every sound magnified and distorted by the geological acoustics of the canyons. By late afternoon, we'd found a sheltered spot near what we thought was Wind Canyon, though it looked different from the photos we'd studied. The rock formations were twisted into impossible shapes, and there were dark stains on the canyon walls that looked disturbingly organic. But it offered protection from the wind, and we were exhausted. Setting up camp took longer than usual. Our tent stakes kept bending against ground that felt harder than concrete, and the fabric of Rob's sleeping bag had somehow developed small tears during the hike. Neither of us remembered snagging it on anything. "Check this out," Rob called from where he was gathering firewood. He was standing next to a cluster of scraggly juniper trees, pointing at something carved into the bark. Deep gouges formed crude symbols, not quite letters, not quite pictures. They looked fresh. The wood still weeping sap, but there was something ancient about their design. The marks were too deep and too clean to have been made by any animal I knew, and too deliberate to be random damage. "Probably just some kids messing around," I said, but my voice caught slightly. We were at least 20 miles from the nearest road, and the terrain we'd covered would have been challenging for experienced hikers, let alone teenagers looking for a place to vandalize trees. Rob traced one of the symbols with his finger, and I watched his expression change. His usual easy grin faded, replaced by something I'd never seen before, a kind of hungry fascination that made my stomach clench. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "Look at the symmetry. It's like they're trying to tell us something." "Rob." I grabbed his shoulder, pulling his hand away from the tree. His skin felt cold even through his jacket, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed to reflect the dying afternoon light like an animal's. "Come on, man. Help me get this fire started." He blinked, and the moment passed. "Yeah, sure. Sorry, they remind me of something I can't quite remember." We managed to get a fire going as darkness fell, but it behaved strangely. The flames burned an unsettling blue-green color and threw shadows that moved independently of the wind. Worse, the fire seemed to consume wood without actually burning it. The logs remained intact even as the flames danced over them, and no matter how much fuel we added, the fire never grew larger than the size of a dinner plate. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. I'm talking about a bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Our breath came out in steaming clouds, and frost began forming on our gear despite the fact that it had been nearly 60 degrees that afternoon. "This is fucked," I said, zipping my jacket up to my chin. "Weather report said mid-40s for the low. This feels like it's below freezing." Rob was staring into the fire, and I noticed he hadn't touched the trail mix I'd offered him. In fact, I couldn't remember seeing him eat anything since we'd started hiking that morning. "Hey," I nudged him with my elbow. "You feeling okay? You look pale." He turned to look at me, and for a split second I could have sworn his face was wrong somehow. Not obviously different, just off in a way that made my primitive brain start screaming warnings. His smile was too wide, lasting a beat too long, and when he blinked it seemed like his eyelids moved too slowly. "I'm fine, Mike. Never been better." His voice sounded normal, but there was something underneath it, like an echo of an echo. Just thinking about those symbols, I keep feeling like I've seen them before. "Where?" "I don't know. Maybe in a dream." He laughed, but it came out forced and hollow. "You know how sometimes you have those dreams that feel more real than being awake? Like maybe you're remembering something instead of imagining it?" I didn't like where this conversation was heading. "Rob, you're starting to freak me out a little." "Sorry." He shook his head, and for a moment he looked like himself again. "This place is just intense. All this emptiness makes you think weird thoughts." We tried to heat some canned soup over our pathetic fire, but the contents never warmed up despite sitting directly in the flames for 20 minutes. When I opened a can of beans, they smelled like they'd been rotting for weeks. Even our water had developed a metallic taste that coated the inside of my mouth like copper pennies. "Food's gone bad," I said, dumping the soup onto the ground. The liquid hissed and steamed where it hit the earth, leaving behind a stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Doesn't matter," Rob said quietly. "I'm not really hungry anymore." That should have been the moment I insisted we pack up and hike back to the car in the dark. Rob always had an appetite that bordered on legendary. He could put away an entire pizza and still have room for dessert, but something about the way he said it, combined with the weird energy radiating from him, made me want to avoid an argument. We crawled into our respective sleeping bags as full darkness settled over the Badlands. I'd camped dozens of times before, but I'd never experienced darkness like this. It wasn't just the absence of light, It was like a physical presence that pressed against the tent walls and whispered things I couldn't quite understand. The silence was equally oppressive. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Even the wind had died to nothing, leaving us suspended in a void that felt more like being buried alive than being outdoors. I was just starting to drift off when I heard Rob unzipping his sleeping bag. "Where you going?" I mumbled. "Bathroom," he whispered. "Go back to sleep." I heard the tent zipper, then footsteps moving away into the darkness. But something was wrong with the sound. Rob wore heavy hiking boots that should have made distinctive thuds against the hard-packed earth. Instead, his footsteps sounded muffled and irregular, like he was walking on something soft and wet. Sleep took me despite my unease, but it was filled with dreams that felt more like memories. I was running through endless corridors carved from living rock, chased by something that breathed like winter wind and smelled like spoiled meat. Every time I looked back, the thing pursuing me looked a little more like Rob, until by the end of the dream, it was Rob, but wrong in ways my sleeping mind couldn't articulate. I woke to gray pre-dawn light filtering through the tent walls and the sound of something, moving around outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circled our campsite in a perfect pattern, always maintaining exactly the same distance from the tent. "Rob," I called softly. The footsteps stopped. "Rob, is that you?" A voice answered from right outside the tent wall, inches from my head. "Yes, Mike, it's me." But it wasn't Rob's voice. It had his accent, his inflection, even his slight lisp on the S sounds. But underneath, there was something else. Something that sounded like it was learning how to use human vocal cords and hadn't quite mastered the technique. "Come back inside, man. It's cold out there." "In a minute. I'm just looking at something." "What?" There was a long pause before the voice replied. "The symbols. They're everywhere now. All over the rocks. All over the trees. They're beautiful, Mike. They're telling me things." I unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. Rob was standing about 20 feet away with his back to me, perfectly still. He was staring up at the canyon wall, where hundreds of the crude symbols had been carved deep into the rock. They covered every available surface, overlapping and intertwining like some kind of insane manuscript written in an alphabet that hurt to look at. "Rob, those weren't there yesterday." He turned around slowly, and I bit back a scream. His face was still recognizably his, but something fundamental had changed. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes reflected the morning light with an amber gleam that belonged on a nocturnal predator. When he smiled, I could see that his teeth had grown longer and sharper, like he'd been filing them to points. "Weren't they?" His voice carried that same not-quite-right quality, as if something else was operating his vocal cords like a puppet. "I think they've always been here. I think we just couldn't see them before." "Jesus Christ, Rob, what happened to you?" "Nothing happened to me. I'm exactly the same." He took a step closer, and I noticed that his movement was too fluid, like his joints had been replaced with something that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. "I'm just more now. Better. I understand things I never understood before." "Like what?" "Like hunger. Real hunger. The kind that gnaws at your bones and whispers in your dreams." His eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The kind that can only be satisfied with warm meat torn fresh from living bone. I scrambled backward into the tent, fumbling for the bear spray I'd clipped to the inside wall. "Stay away from me, Rob. I don't know what's wrong with you, but nothing's wrong with me." His voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. "I'm perfect now. I'm what I was always meant to be." The tent shook as something large threw itself against the outside. I could hear claws, actual claws, ripping through the fabric, and a smell like rotting meat and wet fur filled the confined space. I sprayed the bear deterrent blindly through the tears in the tent wall and heard a howl of rage that definitely didn't come from human lungs. I burst out of the ruined tent and ran. The Badlands had transformed overnight into something from a fever dream. The symbols covered every surface now: rocks, trees, even the ground beneath my feet. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and looking at them too long made my vision blur and my head pound. Behind me, I could hear Rob, or the thing that had been Rob, giving chase. But it wasn't running on two legs anymore. The sound was the rhythmic thudding of something large and predatory moving on all fours, interspersed with huffing breaths that sounded more like a bear or a wolf than anything human. I ran through the maze of canyons and rock formations, my lungs burning in the thin air. Every path looked the same. Every turn led to another identical stretch of eroded badlands. It was like the landscape was actively working against me, rearranging itself to keep me trapped in an endless loop. The thing that had been Rob was gaining ground. I could hear it getting closer, and occasionally I caught glimpses of it in my peripheral vision. Something that walked like a man but moved like an animal, with elongated limbs and fingers that had grown into curved talons. I ducked into a narrow crevice between two towering rock formations, pressing myself against the cold stone and trying to control my breathing. The symbols were here too, carved so deep into the rock that they looked like they'd been burned in with acid. The sounds of pursuit stopped. For long minutes there was nothing but the hammering of my heart and the whistle of wind through the rock formations. Then I heard Rob's voice, perfectly normal again, calling from somewhere nearby. "Mike! Mike, where are you? I think I got lost. I think something's wrong with me." It sounded exactly like him, confused, scared, human. For a moment, I almost believed it. Almost. "Mike, please. I need help. I don't remember what happened. I woke up, and you were gone, and there's blood on my hands, and I don't know where it came from." I stayed hidden, biting my lip until I tasted copper to keep from crying out, because I could see him now, standing at the entrance to my hiding spot, and while his voice sounded perfectly human, his silhouette was all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung past his knees and a head that tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "I found your trail, Mike. I can smell you." He stepped into the crevice, and I got my first clear look at what he'd become. The thing still wore Rob's face, but it was like a mask that didn't quite fit. His features had stretched and elongated, giving him a gaunt, starved appearance. His skin had turned the color of old parchment, and it seemed to hang loose in places, as if whatever was underneath was a different shape than what the skin had originally covered. But it was his eyes that made me nearly lose control of my bladder. They were still Rob's brown eyes, but they were completely empty of anything human. They held the cold, calculating intelligence of a predator that sees everything around it as potential food. "There you are," he said, and his voice was wrong again, too deep, with harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "I've been looking everywhere for you." His mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that had grown in behind his regular ones. A smell like a slaughterhouse in summer heat poured out of his throat. I sprayed the bear mace directly into his face. The thing that had been Rob reeled backward, clawing at its eyes and making sounds like a cat being skinned alive. But instead of running away, it seemed to become more enraged. When it looked at me again, all pretense of humanity was gone. Its features had shifted into something that belonged in prehistoric nightmares: elongated skull, pronounced brow ridge, jaw that jutted forward to accommodate all those new teeth. It lunged at me. I barely managed to dodge, throwing myself sideways as razor-sharp claws raked the air where my head had been. The thing's momentum carried it into the rock wall with a sound like a gunshot, but it recovered instantly and spun around to face me again. I ran deeper into the crevice, hoping it would lead to another exit. Instead, it narrowed until I could barely squeeze through, the walls closing in around me like a stone throat. Behind me, I could hear the thing trying to follow, its claws scraping against rock as it forced its transformed body through the increasingly tight space. The crevice opened into a small circular chamber carved from the living rock. More symbols covered the walls here, but these were different. Older, deeper, carved with a precision that spoke of ritual rather than random madness. In the center of the chamber sat a pile of bones that looked disturbingly human. I was trapped. The scratching sounds were getting closer, and I could smell that overwhelming stench of decay and wet fur. In desperation, I began piling loose rocks into the mouth of the crevice, trying to create a barrier. It was futile. The rocks were too small and the opening too wide, but it was all I could think to do. The thing that had been Rob squeezed through the opening like liquid poured through a funnel, its body contorting in ways that defied anatomy. When it stood up in the chamber, it was even taller than before, having to duck to avoid hitting the ceiling with its elongated skull. "Mike," it said in Rob's voice, but the mouth movements didn't match the words. "Why are you running from me? I just want to share this with you. I want to show you what I've learned." "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm what humans become when they remember what they really are." It took a step closer, and I could see that its feet had changed too, becoming something closer to paws with curved claws for toes. "We were never meant to be civilized, Mike. We were meant to hunt, to feed, to take what we need from the weak." "That's not human. That's not what humans are." "Isn't it?" The thing tilted its head and I heard vertebrae popping like knuckles. "What do you think your ancestors did before there were cities and laws and moral codes? How do you think our species survived when everything else wanted to kill us?" It was close enough now that I could see my reflection in its eyes. Small, terrified, utterly helpless. Its breath was hot and moist against my face, carrying the sweet, sick smell of something that had been eating things that should never be eaten. "The symbols, Mike? They're instructions. A guidebook written by the ones who came before. They show you how to shed all the lies civilization has taught you, how to become what you were always meant to be." One of its claws traced a line down my cheek, parting the skin like tissue paper. Blood ran warm down my neck. "It doesn't hurt for long," it whispered in Rob's voice, "and afterward, you'll understand everything. You'll be grateful." I closed my eyes and waited for death. Instead, I heard a sound like a tree branch snapping, followed by a howl of pain and rage. When I opened my eyes, the thing was writhing on the ground, clutching its right leg. One of the larger rocks I'd tried to use as a barrier had shifted under its weight, and its foot had become wedged in a crack between two massive stone slabs. It was trapped. I didn't wait to see if it could free itself. I scrambled over its thrashing body and squeezed back through the crevice, scraping skin off my arms and back in my haste to escape. Behind me, the howling continued, echoing through the stone passages like the cry of something that had never been human to begin with. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs refused to carry me any further. When I finally collapsed, gasping and shaking, I found myself on a ridge overlooking our campsite. The twisted thing that had been Rob was no longer following me. Either it was still trapped in the stone chamber, or it had found another way out and was stalking me from the shadows. Our camp was destroyed. The tent had been shredded as if by wild animals, and our gear was scattered across a wide area. But worse were the footprints in the soft earth around our fire pit. They started out human-sized and shaped, but gradually became something else. Longer, wider, with deep claw marks instead of toe impressions. I could trace the exact moment when Rob had stopped being human. My hand shook as I gathered what remained of our supplies. The GPS was still dead, the map was still wrong, and I had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. But I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever had taken Rob was still out there, and it was hungry for more than just meat. It was hungry for the thing that made people human, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed every trace of humanity in these badlands. I started walking. The landscape seemed to shift around me as I moved, paths appearing and disappearing, rock formations rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The symbols followed me everywhere, carved into every available surface, growing more complex and numerous the further I traveled. They were beautiful, I had to admit, hypnotic in their intricacy. Sometimes I found myself stopping to trace their patterns with my finger, feeling a strange warmth spread up my arm as I did so. They whispered to me in a language I almost understood, promising things I almost wanted. It took me 3 days to find the main trail again. 3 days of walking in circles, of hearing footsteps that stopped whenever I turned around, of finding freshly killed animals with surgical precision bite marks that looked almost human. 3 days of fighting the urge to carve my own symbols into the trees, to join the conversation that was happening all around me in a script I was starting to read. By the time I stumbled onto the Ma Da Hay Trail proper, I was barely coherent. A park ranger found me collapsed near mile marker 23, severely dehydrated and talking about things he couldn't understand. They airlifted me to a hospital in Bismarck, where I spent a week recovering from exposure and exhaustion. I told them Rob had fallen into a crevice and I couldn't get him out. I told them I'd gotten lost trying to find help. I didn't mention the symbols or the transformation or the thing with his face that had tried to teach me the true nature of hunger. They searched for 3 weeks and never found any trace of him. No body, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The crevice I described didn't exist on any of their maps, and the chamber full of bones was nowhere to be found. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls from a number I recognize. Rob's number, even though they shut off his service months ago. When I answer, there's nothing but breathing on the other end. Deep, rhythmic breathing that sounds like it's coming from lungs much larger than human lungs should be. And sometimes, the breathing sounds hungry. I moved to Florida after that. Got as far away from North Dakota as I could manage. But it doesn't matter where I go. I still see the symbols. Carved into bathroom stalls, spray-painted on underpasses, etched into the bark of palm trees. They're everywhere once you learn to recognize them, spreading like a virus through the hidden corners of civilization. Last week, I found one carved into the coffee table in my apartment. I know I didn't put it there, but I can't remember not putting it there either. And when I traced it with my finger, just to see what it felt like, that familiar warmth spread up my arm and whispered things I'm starting to understand. The thing is, I'm getting hungry lately. Really hungry. The kind of hunger that gnaws at your bones and whispers in your dreams. Regular food doesn't seem to satisfy it anymore, and I've been having dreams about warm meat torn fresh from living bone. I keep telling myself it's just trauma, post-traumatic stress from what happened to Rob, but deep down, where the symbols have started to take root in my mind, I know the truth. The infection is spreading, and I'm not sure I want to stop it anymore. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023, deep in the backcountry wilderness near Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, where the Badlands stretch endlessly under a sky so vast it makes you feel like an insect crawling across the face of eternity. I should have listened to the warnings. The whole trip was supposed to be a reset, a chance to clear my head after the divorce, after losing the house, after everything fell apart. 3 days of dispersed camping in the most remote section of the Little Missouri National Grassland. Just me and my German Shepherd, Rex. No cell towers, no people, no reminders of the life I'd spectacularly failed to hold together. Rex had been my constant companion through the worst of it. When Sarah packed her bags and left, when the lawyers circled like vultures, when the depression hit so hard I could barely get out of bed, Rex was there. His amber eyes held no judgment, only loyalty. If anything could help me find some peace in the wilderness, it would be him. The drive north from Bismarck took 4 hours on increasingly desolate roads. I turned off Highway 85 near Watford City, following a series of gravel tracks that seemed to lead nowhere. The landscape was alien. Rolling prairie punctuated by twisted badland formations that looked like the bones of some long-dead god. Buttes rose from the earth like ancient fortresses, their layered sediment telling stories older than human memory. By the time I found a suitable campsite, the sun was hanging low in the western sky, painting the badlands in shades of rust and amber. I'd driven nearly 8 miles off the main road, following what might generously be called a two-track through the grassland. The spot I chose was perfect, a slight depression surrounded by low hills, with a seasonal creek bed nearby that might yield water if I dug down a foot or two. Rex jumped out of the truck, immediately alert and sniffing the air. His ears were pricked forward, and he was making low whining sounds I'd never heard before. For a moment, I thought he might have caught the scent of coyotes or elk, but then he relaxed and began his usual routine of marking territory around our new domain. Setting up camp was routine work that I found oddly comforting. The familiar ritual of raising the tent, organizing gear, gathering firewood, it all helped quiet the noise in my head. Rex stayed close, which was unusual for him. Normally, he'd range in wide circles, investigating every interesting scent and sound. Today, he seemed content to lie in the dirt nearby, watching me work with those intelligent eyes. As darkness approached, I got a fire going in a ring of stones I'd collected from the creek bed. The dry prairie grass caught easily, and soon I had a cheerful blaze that pushed back the gathering shadows. Rex lay beside me, his massive head resting on his paws, but I noticed his ears kept swiveling toward the darkness beyond our little circle of light. The silence out here was profound in a way that city dwellers could never truly understand. No traffic, no air conditioning units, no distant highway hum, just the vast emptiness of the northern plains under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck. The Milky Way sprawled overhead like spilled flour, and I felt that familiar combination of wonder and existential dread that comes from confronting your own insignificance. I heated a can of chili over the fire and shared half of it with Rex, along with some of the jerky I'd brought. We ate in comfortable silence, two companions grateful for each other's company in the immensity of the grassland. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkness where they winked out like dying stars. It was around 9 o'clock when I first heard the sound. It came from somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, a low, rhythmic noise that might have been wind in the grass, except there was no wind. Rex's head snapped up immediately, his body going rigid with attention. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, reaching for the flashlight I kept clipped to my belt. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but prairie grass swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sound had stopped the moment I turned on the light. Rex relaxed slightly but continued watching the darkness with obvious suspicion. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that night sounds could be deceptive. What seemed ominous might be nothing more than a small animal foraging, or the wind playing tricks with the landscape. But this felt different. The sound had been too regular, too purposeful, almost like footsteps. "Probably just a deer," I told Rex, scratching behind his ears. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I'd heard deer move through brush before. This had been something else. I banked the fire and settled into my sleeping bag, leaving the rain fly off the tent so I could see the stars. Rex curled up beside me, his warm bulk a comforting presence in the darkness. But even as exhaustion pulled at me, I found myself listening for that rhythmic sound, straining to hear something that might explain the growing unease in my gut. Sleep came fitfully, filled with strange dreams of vast underground chambers and something hungry prowling the edges of consciousness. I woke several times to find Rex sitting alert beside the tent, staring out into the darkness with those amber eyes gleaming in the starlight. The second day dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. I woke to find Rex already up and pacing the perimeter of our camp, nose to the ground as if following a scent trail. His behavior was odd. Normally, he'd be eager to start the day's adventure, but today he seemed agitated, almost fearful. I made coffee over the rebuilt fire and studied the surrounding landscape in daylight. The Badlands stretched in all directions, a maze of eroded buttes and hidden coulees that could hide an army. To the north, I could see the darker smudge of the Little Missouri River Valley, while the southern horizon was dominated by a particularly impressive formation of layered rock that looked like a sleeping giant. After breakfast, I decided to explore one of the nearby coulees, a deep ravine cut into the prairie by centuries of spring runoff. Rex followed reluctantly, staying close to my heels instead of ranging ahead as he usually did. The coulee was deeper than it had appeared from above, its walls rising nearly 30 feet on either side. The bottom was littered with smooth stones and the bleached bones of small animals. It was there that I found the first real sign that something was wrong. Carved into the soft sandstone wall of the coulee, about 7 feet up, were symbols that definitely weren't natural. They looked vaguely like pictographs, the kind Native Americans might have left centuries ago, but there was something wrong about them. The lines were too fresh for one thing, cut deep into the rock with what must have been metal tools, and the images themselves were disturbing. Twisted figures that might have been human, animals with too many legs, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. Rex was whimpering now, pressing close against my legs as I studied the carvings. His entire body was trembling, and when I reached down to comfort him, I could feel his heart racing. "Easy, boy," I murmured, but I was feeling the same inexplicable dread. There was something fundamentally wrong about this place, something that triggered a primal fear I couldn't rationalize. We climbed out of the coulee quickly, Rex scrambling up the steep sides with desperate urgency. Once we were back on level ground, he seemed to relax slightly, but I noticed he kept looking back toward the ravine with obvious distress. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I read a paperback thriller by the fire, Rex dozed in the afternoon sun, and I tried to convince myself that the carved symbols were just some teenager's idea of a prank. People came out here sometimes. Hunters, hikers, kids looking for a place to party away from parental supervision. It made sense that someone might have decided to play amateur archaeologist with a hunting knife and too much free time. But as evening approached, the unease returned. Rex became increasingly agitated as the sun sank toward the western horizon. He paced the campsite restlessly, stopping frequently to stare into the gathering darkness and growl at things I couldn't see. I built up the fire early, creating a larger blaze than I really needed. The flames leaped high into the darkness, casting dancing shadows that made the surrounding landscape seem alive and threatening. Rex pressed close to me, his big body trembling with tension. The sound came again just after full dark, that same rhythmic noise from the night before, but closer now, much closer. And this time, there was no mistaking it for wind or the movement of small animals. Whatever was making that sound was large, and it was circling our camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. Rex erupted into barking, deep, vicious sounds I'd never heard from him before. His hackles were raised along his entire back, making him look twice his normal size. He stood at the edge of our circle of light, every muscle taut with aggression, warning whatever was out there to stay back. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness. For just a moment, I thought I saw something, a pale shape moving between the distant buttes. But when I focused the light on it, nothing was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vastness. "Is someone there?" The only response was the cessation of the rhythmic sound. Rex's barking faded to a low growl, then to anxious whimpering. We sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence and jumping at every small sound. The crack of a cooling ember, the distant call of a nighthawk, the whisper of wind through grass. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I crawled into my sleeping bag with Rex pressed against my side. But sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, it brought dreams of ancient hunger and things that should have stayed buried. The third morning brought a crisis that changed everything. I woke to find Rex gone. At first, I wasn't too concerned. He was a well-trained dog who'd never wandered far from camp before, but dogs will be dogs, and sometimes an interesting scent was too tempting to resist. I called his name while I made coffee, expecting to see him come bounding back any moment with his tongue lolling and his tail wagging. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, concern became worry, then fear. Rex had never been away from my side for more than a few minutes during our previous camping trips. Something was wrong. I spent the morning searching, calling his name until my throat was raw. I followed his tracks where I could find them, but they led into increasingly rough terrain where the rocky ground gave up no secrets. By noon, I was fighting panic. Rex wasn't just a pet. He was family, the one constant in my life that had kept me sane through the divorce and everything that followed. The afternoon was a blur of frantic searching. I covered miles of badland terrain, calling until I had no voice left, following every game trail and peering into every coulee. But the landscape seemed to have swallowed him completely. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, I was forced to accept that I might have lost him forever. I returned to camp as darkness fell, emotionally and physically exhausted. The fire seemed smaller and less welcoming without Rex's presence beside it. I heated another can of chili, but food tasted like ash in my mouth. The silence of the prairie, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt oppressive and threatening. It was just after midnight when Rex came back. I was sitting by the dying fire, too worried and depressed to sleep, when I heard the soft padding of paws on grass. My heart leaped with relief and I scrambled for my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkness until it found him. "Rex! Jesus, boy, where have you been?" But something was wrong. Rex stood just at the edge of the light, perfectly still, staring at me with those amber eyes. He wasn't panting, wasn't wagging his tail, wasn't showing any of the usual signs of excitement at being reunited with his pack leader. He just stood there, good, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Come here, boy," I called softly. "It's okay. Come on." Rex took a few steps forward, moving with an odd mechanical gait that was nothing like his usual fluid movement. When he reached the edge of the firelight, I could see him clearly, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. He looked like Rex, same size, same markings, same intelligent face, but his eyes were wrong. Instead of the warm amber I knew so well, they reflected the firelight with a cold, predatory gleam. And his mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed somehow longer and sharper than they should be. "Rex?" I whispered. He tilted his head at the sound of his name, but the movement was too quick, too jerky, like a puppet being manipulated by an amateur. And when he smiled, dogs don't smile, but that's the only word for the expression that crossed his face, I saw far too many teeth crowded into his mouth. I backed away slowly, my hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife on my belt. Whatever was standing in front of me, it wasn't my dog. It couldn't be. Rex would never look at me with such cold calculation, would never stand so still when I was clearly distressed. The thing that looked like Rex took another step forward, and I could smell it now, a reek of decay and old meat that made my stomach turn. When it spoke, the words came out in Rex's familiar whine, but they formed sounds that no dog throat should have been able to make. "David," it said, the syllables stretched and distorted. "David, help me." I ran. I didn't think. Didn't grab my gear, didn't do anything but turn and sprint into the darkness beyond the firelight. Behind me, I could hear the thing that wore my dog's face giving chase, its paws making wet, slapping sounds on the prairie grass. But there was something else, too. A sound like laughter, if laughter could be made of hunger and malice. I ran blindly through the darkness, stumbling over stones and prairie dog holes, thorns tearing at my clothes and skin. The landscape that had seemed beautiful in daylight was now a maze of shadows and hidden dangers. I could hear my pursuer behind me, sometimes close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck, sometimes seeming to fall back only to appear from an entirely different direction. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I found myself in a coulee, not the one where I discovered the carvings, but one much deeper and narrower. The walls rose steeply on either side, and the bottom was choked with fallen rocks and twisted driftwood from long-ago floods. I pressed myself against the sandstone wall, trying to control my ragged breathing while I listened for sounds of pursuit. Silence. I waited, every nerve stretched to the breaking point, but there was nothing. No padding of paws, no sound of breathing, no wet laughter echoing off the coulee walls. Whatever had been chasing me seemed to have given up. Slowly, carefully, I made my way deeper into the ravine. The walls were higher here, rising perhaps 50 feet on either side, and the bottom was barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. It felt like being in a tomb, but at least it offered protection from whatever was out there wearing my dog's face. I found a partially sheltered spot beneath an overhang and settled down to wait for dawn. Without my sleeping bag, the October night was brutally cold, and I huddled against the rock wall trying to conserve body heat while my mind raced. What had I seen back at the campsite? It couldn't have been Rex. Dogs don't speak, don't smile with too many teeth, don't smell like rotting meat. But it had looked exactly like him, down to the small scar on his muzzle from a childhood encounter with a cat. How was that possible? The carved symbols I'd found earlier came back to me, those twisted figures that had made Rex whimper and my skin crawl. Had they been some kind of warning? A record of something that had happened here before? As the night wore on, I began to piece together a horrifying possibility. The local folklore I'd read about before coming here mentioned something called the Mini-Washitu, a water monster that supposedly lived in the Missouri River. But there were other legends too, older ones that spoke of things that came from deep underground, hungry things that could wear the faces of loved ones to lure the unwary to their doom. What if something like that lived in these Badlands? What if it had taken Rex, the real Rex, and was now wearing his form like a mask? The thought was insane, but no more insane than what I'd witnessed. And if it was true, then my dog was already dead, consumed by whatever was now hunting me through the darkness. Dawn seemed to take forever to arrive, but when the first pale light began to filter into the coulee, I started moving. I needed to get back to my campsite, gather my gear, and get the hell out of this place. The thing that looked like Rex might be waiting for me, but I couldn't survive another night in the open without supplies. The trip back to camp took nearly 2 hours. I moved carefully, using every scrap of cover the landscape provided, constantly scanning for signs of my pursuer. But the Badlands seemed empty and peaceful in the morning light, giving no hint of the horrors that had stalked me through the darkness. My campsite was exactly as I'd left it. Fire burned down to cold ashes, sleeping bags still laid out beside the tent, cooking gear scattered around the dead embers. There was no sign of the thing that had worn Rex's face. I worked quickly, stuffing gear into my pack with shaking hands. All I wanted was to reach my truck and put as many miles as possible between myself and this cursed place. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard a familiar whine from the direction of the tent. Rex was there, lying in the shade beside the collapsed nylon, looking exactly like the dog I'd known and loved for 6 years. His tail thumped weakly against the ground when he saw me, and his amber eyes held their familiar warmth and intelligence. "Rex," I whispered, hardly daring to believe it. He struggled to his feet, moving like an animal that had been through some terrible ordeal. His fur was matted with burrs and mud, and there were scratches along his flanks that looked like claw marks. But his eyes were right. They were Rex's eyes, full of confusion and relief at seeing me again. I approached slowly, watching for any sign that this might be another deception. But when Rex reached me, he pressed his muzzle against my leg and made the soft, whiffling sounds he always made when he was happy. There was no smell of decay, no predatory gleam in his eyes. This was my dog, somehow returned to me. "Where have you been, boy?" I asked, running my hands over his body to check for injuries. He seemed intact, just exhausted and traumatized. Whatever had happened to him during his night away had left him subdued, but alive. As I packed the last of my gear, Rex stayed close beside me, occasionally looking over his shoulder at the surrounding landscape with obvious nervousness. He was eager to leave this place, and so was I. The hike back to my truck took an hour, and with every step, I felt the weight of the Badlands' malevolent attention lifting from my shoulders. Rex trotted beside me, moving more like his old self with each mile we put behind us. By the time we reached the vehicle, he was actually showing signs of his normal enthusiasm. I loaded our gear into the bed of the truck and opened the passenger door for Rex. He jumped in eagerly, settling into his usual spot with a deep sigh that seemed to say he was as glad to be leaving as I was. The drive back to civilization passed without incident. We stopped in Watford City for gas and food, and I called my insurance company to report the accident that had damaged my camping equipment. I didn't mention the strange symbols, the thing that had worn Rex's face, or any of the other inexplicable events of the past 3 days. Who would have believed me? It wasn't until we were nearly back to Bismarck that I noticed Rex's strange behavior. He'd been quiet during the drive, which I'd attributed to exhaustion. But now he was sitting rigidly in the passenger seat, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I glanced over at him, he didn't look away or soften his gaze as he normally would. He just kept staring with those amber eyes that suddenly didn't seem quite the right shade. "What is it, boy?" I asked, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. Rex pulled back from my touch, his lips curling to reveal teeth that looked longer and sharper than I remembered. And when he spoke, because he did speak, forming words with a dog's throat in a voice like grinding stone, I nearly drove off the road. "Thank you, David," he said, his tail wagging slowly. "Thank you for bringing me home." I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The truck skidded to a stop on the empty highway, and I turned to stare at the thing sitting beside me. It still looked like Rex, but now I could see the subtle differences. The 2 sharp teeth, the eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's, the way it held its head at an angle no dog could manage. "You're not Rex," I whispered. The thing smiled, an expression that was horrible on a dog's face. "Rex is here," it said. "Rex is inside. He's screaming." I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to get out of the confined space with this abomination. But before I could escape, the thing that wore my dog's face lunged across the cab, its jaws snapping inches from my throat. I threw myself backward, my hand finding the hunting knife on my belt. The blade caught it just below the rib cage, sliding between bones with surprising ease. The thing let out a howl that was equal parts animal pain and something else, something that spoke of vast underground spaces and appetites older than human civilization. Black blood sprayed across the truck's interior as the creature writhed on the knife. For a moment, its disguise slipped, and I caught a glimpse of what it really was, something pale and elongated, with too many joints and eyes like black holes in its skull. Then the disguise snapped back into place, and Rex's familiar face was looking at me with hurt and confusion. "David," he whimpered, blood foaming at his lips. "Why did you hurt me?" The knife felt like lead in my hand. What if I was wrong? What if the stress and isolation had finally driven me insane and I was actually killing my beloved companion? What if Rex really had just been traumatized by his night alone in the wilderness, and my paranoid delusions had led me to murder the one creature that had loved me unconditionally? The thing, Rex, died with its head in my lap, looking up at me with eyes that held either forgiveness or accusation, depending on what I chose to believe. I drove the rest of the way to Bismarck with my dog's corpse in the passenger seat, my mind cycling between guilt and terror. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a stress-induced psychotic break. I'd killed Rex in a moment of madness, nothing more. But when I carried his body into my building, Rex's blood had turned to something black and foul-smelling that ate through the cardboard box I'd wrapped him in. And that night, as I tried to sleep, I could hear him scratching at my door from the outside, whimpering my name in that grinding stone voice. I haven't answered. It's been 3 months since I came back from the Badlands, and the scratching comes every night now. Sometimes it's at the door, sometimes at the windows, sometimes from inside the walls themselves. During the day, I'll catch glimpses of Rex watching me from across the street or sitting in parked cars, always with that horrible smile and those two bright eyes. I've tried moving, but it doesn't matter. The thing I brought back from the wilderness has learned to wear other faces now. Neighbors, co-workers, strangers on the street. I can always tell which ones aren't real by their eyes and the way they smile too wide. They all whisper the same thing when they think I'm not listening. Thank you, David. Thank you for bringing us home. I know now that I didn't kill Rex that day in the truck. Rex died in the Badlands, probably on that first night when he went missing. What I killed was something else. Something that had been waiting in those twisted coulees for God knows how long for someone foolish enough to venture into its territory. But killing it didn't send it back to wherever it came from. It just set it free. Sometimes I think about driving back to those remote Badlands, finding that coulee with the carved symbols, and trying to undo whatever I've done. But I know it wouldn't work. The thing that wears familiar faces is spreading now, moving through the world one person at a time, and every new face it learns to wear makes it stronger. I write this as a warning to anyone who might read it. Stay away from the remote areas near Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Don't go wandering alone in the grasslands where the wind carries sounds that shouldn't exist. And if your dog, or your husband, or your child, or your best friend goes missing in the wilderness and comes back different, don't trust your eyes. Sometimes the things we love most are exactly what the darkness uses to destroy us. The scratching at my door is starting again. This time it sounds like human fingernails instead of claws. This time, when I look through the peephole, I see my ex-wife Sarah standing in the hallway, smiling that too wide smile with eyes like black mirrors. She's holding a suitcase, as if she's planning to move back in. "David," she calls through the door, her voice exactly as I remember it. "David, I'm sorry. I want to come home." I won't answer. I can't answer. Because I know that somewhere in those Badlands, the real Sarah is probably screaming too, trapped inside something hungry that wears her face like a mask. The scratching is getting louder now, more insistent. I think it's learning patience.